Close your eyes, breathe in the scent of pine needles, and listen closely. Can you hear the soft pitter-patter of tiny paws on the forest floor? Beyond the misty mountains and past the river that sparkles like diamonds, there is a place called the Whispering Woods. In this magical forest, every tree has a secret, every breeze tells a tale, and every animal has a lesson to share. Are you tucked in tight? Are you ready for an adventure? Then let's step into the moonlight and discover our very first story. Story 1. Once upon a time, in the heart of the Whispering Woods, lived a little bear named Benny. Benny was famous for two things: his very soft, cinnamon-colored fur and his very big appetite for honey. One sunny morning, while wandering near the great oak tree, Benny spotted something sparkling on a mossy stump. It was a beautiful blue honey pot, left there by his friend Rosie the rabbit. The air around the pot smelled like 1,000 summer flowers. Benny's tummy gave a loud rumble-grumble. He looked left. He looked right. Rosie was nowhere to be seen. Just one little lick won't hurt, Benny whispered to himself. He dipped his paw into the golden, sticky honey and took a big, sweet bite. It was the most delicious honey he had ever tasted. But suddenly, he heard a twig snap. Frightened, Benny quickly pushed the lid back on and scrambled away into the deep bushes. All afternoon, Benny tried to play, but he didn't feel like his usual happy self. When he saw Rosie later that day, she looked very sad. "Benny," she sighed, "someone moved my special honey pot today. I was saving it for the forest feast tonight. Now the lid is sticky, and I feel sad that a friend didn't just ask me for a taste." Benny felt a heavy, cold stone drop into his stomach. Even though the honey was sweet, the secret felt bitter. That night, Benny couldn't sleep. The owls seemed to hoot. Who took the honey? Who told a lie? He realized that hiding the truth was much harder than admitting he was wrong. The next morning, as soon as the sun peeked over the hills, Benny hurried to Rosie's burrow. His heart was thumping like a little drum. "Rosie," he said, his voice trembling just a bit. "It was me. I took your honey without asking, and I am so sorry." Rosie looked at Benny for a long moment. Then, a kind smile spread across her face. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Benny," she said. "The honey is gone, but our trust is back. That is much more important." Benny felt the heavy stone in his stomach disappear instantly. He learned that while honey is sweet, a clean heart and a true friendship are the sweetest things of all. Story 2. Deep in the Whispering Woods, where the oak trees grow tall and the leaves turn to gold, lived a very busy squirrel named Sammy. Sammy was the fastest runner and the best jumper in the whole forest. He had a bushy red tail that swished whenever he was excited, and right now, Sammy was very excited. Winter was coming, and that meant it was time to collect acorns. Sammy worked harder than anyone else. While the other squirrels played tag in the branches, Sammy was busy digging. He found the roundest, crunchiest acorns and hid them in a secret hollow inside an old willow tree. "These are all mine," Sammy whispered to himself, patting his pile. "Every single one. I'll be the warmest and fullest squirrel this winter." One chilly afternoon, Sammy saw his friend Pip. Pip was a smaller squirrel with a thin tail and a very tired face. Pip had been sick with a cold and hadn't been able to gather many nuts. "Hi, Sammy," Pip squeaked softly. "The ground is getting frozen, and I can't find any more food. Do you think you could spare just a few acorns? I'm very hungry." Sammy looked at his mountain of acorns. He had enough to last for 3 winters. But he shook his head. "I worked very hard for these, Pip. If I give them away, I might run out. You should have started earlier." Pip looked down at his tiny paws, nodded sadly, and shivered as he walked away into the cold wind. That night, Sammy sat in his cozy hollow, surrounded by more food than he could ever eat. He took a bite of a delicious acorn, but strangely, it didn't taste very good. He looked at his big pile, and instead of feeling proud, he felt lonely. He thought of Pip out in the cold, with nothing to eat and no one to talk to. The hollow tree felt too big and too quiet. Sammy realized that having everything for yourself isn't very fun if your friends have nothing at all. He couldn't close his eyes. Every time he did, he saw Pip's sad face. Finally, Sammy jumped up. He grabbed a large woven basket and filled it to the very top with his best, crunchiest acorns. He scurried through the dark forest until he reached Pip's tiny nest. "Pip! Wake up!" Sammy called out. When Pip opened the door, Sammy handed him the basket. "I was wrong, Pip. I have more than enough, and a winter is much better when you spend it with friends. Let's bring your things to my hollow. We can share the food and keep each other warm." Pip's eyes brightened, and a big smile spread across his face. For the rest of the winter, the old willow tree was filled with the sound of laughter and cracking shells. Sammy learned that his pile of acorns didn't make him rich. It was the joy of sharing that made him the luckiest squirrel in the woods. Story 3. In the quietest corner of the Whispering Woods, underneath the roots of a giant, ancient fern, lived a tiny mouse named Millie. Millie was so small that a single dewdrop could wash her paws, and a falling autumn leaf looked like a golden blanket to her. While the other animals climbed high trees or ran through the tall grass, Millie often stayed hidden. "The world is just too big for someone as small as me," she would sigh, twitching her velvet ears. One misty morning, the great owl, the wisest teacher in the forest, made an announcement. "High atop Pebble Peak, the great sunflower has bloomed. Its seeds are magical, they can heal any cold and bring strength to the forest. But the path is steep, and the wind is strong. Who will go and bring the seeds back?" The tall deer looked at the jagged rocks and shook his head. "My legs are too long for those narrow paths," he said. The strong bear looked at the slippery stones. "I am too heavy, I might fall," he grumbled. Even the fast fox looked at the swirling mist and stayed quiet. Millie looked at her tiny paws. Her heart was thumping like a little drum. She thought about the sick birds and the tired squirrels who needed those seeds. I will go," she squeaked. The other animals looked down and smiled kindly. "You, Millie. But you are the smallest of us all. That mountain is a giant." But Millie didn't listen to her fear. She began to climb. At first, it was easy, but soon the pebbles felt like boulders. A small gust of wind felt like a thunderstorm. Her little legs grew tired, and her tiny heart raced. "I can't do this," she whispered, looking at the long way up. But then, she remembered the friends waiting for her below. "Just one more paw step," she told herself. Then another. And another. A bluebird flying by saw her struggle. "Do you want to ride, little Millie?" the bird asked. Millie shook her head bravely. "Thank you, but I must do this myself to show that even a small mouse has a big heart." She kept climbing, using her long tail for balance and her sharp claws to grip the cold stone. Finally, just as the sun began to set, Millie reached the very top. There stood the great sunflower, glowing like a piece of the sun itself. She gathered the shimmering seeds into her little satchel and looked down. The whole forest was spread out below her like a beautiful green carpet. She wasn't afraid of the big world anymore, she was a part of it. When Millie returned to the Whispering Woods, the animals cheered so loudly the leaves trembled. The great owl leaned down and whispered, "Bravery is not about how big you are, Millie. It is about how big your spirit is when you face something scary." Millie smiled, tucked her tail in, and slept the best sleep of her life, knowing that no mountain is too high if you take it one tiny step at a time. Story 4. Toby was a young turtle with a shell the color of mossy stones and eyes as bright as river pebbles. In the Whispering Woods, most turtles were known for being calm and steady. But Toby was different. Inside his sturdy shell, Toby had a racing heart. Whenever he thought about leaving his favorite sunbathing log, his heart would go thump tap like a tiny drum. The other animals often invited Toby to the Great Blue Lake. "Come on, Toby," the frogs would croak, leaping over lilies. "The water is cool and the dragonflies are dancing." But Toby would just pull his head into his shell. "Maybe tomorrow," he would whisper. To Toby, the path to the lake looked like a dark, scary tunnel full of shadows and strange noises. One afternoon, a little duckling named Gilly got her yellow feathers stuck in some tangled reeds near the edge of the deep woods, far from the water. She began to cry out for help. The wind carried her tiny voice all the way to Toby's sunbathing log. Toby's heart began to race faster than ever. Thump tap, thump tap. He wanted to hide. He wanted to pull his legs in and wait for someone else to go. But Gilly's cries were so sad. "She is scared," Toby thought, "just like I am." Slowly, Toby took one step off his log. Then another. The tall grass tickled his tummy, and the shadows of the trees looked like giant fingers. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it against his shell. "It's okay to be scared," Toby whispered to himself, remembering what his grandmother once told him. "Being brave doesn't mean you aren't afraid, it means you keep going anyway." He moved past the scary bushes and over the crunchy leaves. Each time he felt like stopping, he took a deep breath and focused on the sound of Gilly's voice. Finally, he found her. With his strong, slow beak, he carefully untangled the reeds until Gilly was free. "Thank you, Toby," Gilly chirped, flapping her wings. "You're the bravest turtle in the woods." Toby was surprised. He didn't feel brave, he still felt his heart racing. But as they walked back to the lake together, he realized something wonderful. The shadows weren't monsters, they were just shade. The strange noises were just the wind playing in the leaves. By the time they reached the water, Toby's heart had slowed down to a happy, steady beat. He slipped into the cool blue lake and splashed for the very first time, realizing that the world is much more fun when you don't let a racing heart keep you from a racing adventure. Story 5. Daisy was a young deer with spots like spilled milk and legs that felt a little bit too long for her body. In the Whispering Woods, most animals were busy. The beavers were busy building, the squirrels were busy gathering, and the blue jays were busy shouting at the clouds. Sometimes, everyone was so busy that they forgot to be nice. One gloomy Monday, the rain was drizzling, and the forest felt gray. Daisy was walking down the narrow fern path when she saw Grumpy Gopher struggling to move a heavy wet log away from his front door. Daisy stopped. She remembered what her mother always said, "Treat others the way you want to be treated." "Do you need a little nudge, Mr. Gopher?" Daisy asked softly. Grumpy Gopher grumbled, "I've been huffing and puffing for an hour. No one has stopped to help." Daisy lowered her head and used her strong shoulders to give the log a big shove. With a loud squelch, the log rolled away. Grumpy Gopher stopped grumbling. His little nose twitched. "Well, thank you, Daisy. That was very kind of you." He felt so good that when a tired butterfly landed on his porch a moment later, he didn't shoo it away. Instead, he offered it a dry leaf to rest on. Daisy kept walking. Later, she saw Barnaby the Badger. He had dropped his bundle of dry kindling into a puddle. Usually, Barnaby would stomp his feet and growl, but Daisy jogged over. "Don't worry, Barnaby. I know a spot under the great cedar where the ground is bone dry. Let's move them there together." Barnaby was so surprised by her kindness that he forgot to be angry. "You're a pal, Daisy," he muttered. Because Daisy had been kind to him, Barnaby decided to help a lost turtle find the pond later that afternoon. By the time the sun began to set, something magical had happened in the Whispering Woods. The golden rule was spreading like a warm breeze. The forest wasn't gray or gloomy anymore. The birds were singing sweeter songs, and even the prickly porcupines were sharing their berries. Daisy sat down by the sparkling stream to take a drink. Just then, a heavy rain cloud passed, and the forest floor turned muddy and slippery. Daisy's long legs slid, and she tumbled into a patch of brambles. Oh dear, she sighed, feeling a bit stuck. Suddenly, she heard a chorus of voices. "We're coming, Daisy." Grumpy Gopher, Barnaby the Badger, and even the tiny butterfly appeared. Together, they nipped at the thorns and nudged her back to her feet. "We treat our friends the way they treat us," Barnaby said with a wink. Daisy realized that kindness is like a boomerang. When you throw it out into the world, it always finds its way back to you. That night, the whole forest slept with happy hearts, proving that the smallest act of kindness is the greatest magic of all. Story 6. In the deepest part of the Whispering Woods lived a tiny firefly named Flick. Flick was different from all the other fireflies. While his friends loved to practice their glowing patterns as soon as the sun went down, Flick stayed hidden under a large, waxy leaf. You see, Flick was a firefly who was afraid of the dark. But Flick, his friend Finny would buzz, "You are a light. How can you be afraid of the dark when you carry a lantern in your tail?" Flick would just shake his head and tuck his wings in tight. To him, the night wasn't just dark, it was huge, and cold, and full of shadows that looked like hungry giants. He felt safe only when the sun was shining bright. One evening, a thick, heavy fog rolled into the forest. It was so dense that even the moon couldn't peek through. The forest became pitch black, darker than Flick had ever seen. Suddenly, he heard a worried cry. It was Mama Owl. "Oh dear," she hooted from a low branch. "My littlest owlet, Oliver, has tumbled from the nest, and I cannot see through this fog to find him. It is too dark, even for my owl eyes." Flick's heart did a little somersault. He looked at the terrifying darkness outside his leaf. He wanted to stay hidden. But then he pictured little Oliver, all alone on the cold, mossy ground. Flick took a deep breath. Gulp. He squeezed his eyes shut and thought of something brave. He thought of the warm sun. Slowly, a tiny, dim glow began to flicker from his tail. Then it grew brighter. And brighter. Pop! Flick flew out from under his leaf. He was like a tiny, golden star dancing in the fog. "I'm coming, Mama Owl," he chirped. The darkness tried to swallow his light, but Flick didn't stop. He flew low to the ground, his little lantern cutting through the gray mist. Finally, he spotted a tuft of white fluff shivering behind a mushroom. It was Oliver. "Follow my light, Oliver," Flick cried. He stayed right in front of the owlet's beak, acting as a glowing guide. Step by step, he led Oliver back to the trunk of the great oak, where Mama Owl was waiting with open wings. "You saved him, Flick," Mama Owl whispered, hugging her baby close. "You are the bravest light in the woods." Flick looked around. The forest was still dark, and the shadows were still there, but they didn't look like giants anymore. They just looked like trees. He realized that the dark wasn't something to fear, it was just a place where his light could shine the brightest. From that night on, Flick was the first firefly to come out at sunset. He learned that bravery isn't about the absence of fear, it's about lighting your own lamp and moving forward, even when you can't see the whole path. Story 7. High in the rustling canopy of the Whispering Woods lived Barnaby the Blue Jay. Barnaby was the color of a summer sky, with a crest that stood up like a tiny crown. But Barnaby had a problem. He always wanted what everyone else had. If the squirrels found a large walnut, Barnaby wanted it. If the woodpecker found a shiny beetle, Barnaby wanted that too. He spent so much time looking at his neighbor's treasures that he forgot to enjoy his own beautiful wings. One afternoon, while hopping along a sun-drenched branch, Barnaby spotted something magnificent. It was a silver whistle, dropped by a hiker near the edge of the woods. It glittered like a fallen star. Twit-too. Barnaby dived down and grabbed it. "This is mine," he shrieked. "This is the best treasure in the whole forest. Now I am the most important bird of all." Barnaby flew to the highest branch of the great pine. He tried to blow into the whistle, but it only made a loud, piercing screech. It wasn't a beautiful song like the nightingales, and it wasn't a cheerful chirp like the sparrows. It was a cold, sharp noise that scared away the butterflies and made the deer prick up their ears in fear. But Barnaby didn't care. He clutched the heavy silver whistle in his beak. Because it was so heavy, he couldn't fly very high. Because he had to hold it tight, he couldn't sing his own songs. And because he was so worried someone would steal it, he stopped visiting his friends at the sparkling stream. He sat all alone on his branch, guarding his cold, silver prize. He watched the other birds playing tag in the breeze. He watched the robins sharing a feast of red berries. Barnaby's tummy rumbled, but he couldn't eat. He didn't want to let go of the whistle. He was the richest bird in the woods, but he was also the hungriest and the loneliest. Is this really a treasure? Barnaby wondered, his beak aching from the weight. It doesn't make me fly faster. It doesn't make me sing better. It just makes me tired. Just then, a young squirrel scrambled by. "Wow, Barnaby! That whistle is so shiny. I wish I had one." Barnaby looked at the tired squirrel, then at the heavy silver object. Suddenly, he knew what to do. "You can have it, Pip. It's very shiny, but it's too heavy for a bird who wants to dance in the clouds." Barnaby dropped the whistle into Pip's paws. As soon as he let go, he felt as light as a dandelion seed. He stretched his blue wings, took a deep breath, and let out a long, beautiful, natural warble. It was his own voice, and it sounded sweeter than any silver whistle ever could. He flew down to the berry bushes and joined his friends for dinner. He realized that wanting more things only made his heart heavy. Contentment, being happy with what you have, was the real treasure. That night, Barnaby didn't dream of silver or gold. He dreamed of the blue sky and the wind beneath his wings, and that was more than enough. Story 8. Deep in the mossy hollows of the Whispering Woods lived Hugo the hedgehog. Hugo was a very tidy hedgehog with quills that looked like a tiny, prickly pincushion. Hugo liked to do everything by himself. "If you want a tunnel dug right, dig it yourself," he would huff, pushing a heavy pebble with his snout. "If you want the best berries, find them yourself." He was very proud of being independent. One windy afternoon, the forest warden, a very old and very forgetful badger named Barnaby, was in a panic. "The silver key. It's gone," he wailed, splashing through the puddles of the sparkling stream. The silver key opened the great acorn storehouse, where all the forest animals kept their extra food for the rainy season. Without it, everyone would go hungry during the coming storms. Hugo watched from under a mushroom. "I'll find it," he whispered to himself. "And I'll do it all alone. Then everyone will see how helpful I am." Hugo started his search. He looked under the ferns. He looked behind the waterfall. He even climbed halfway up a slippery log. But the forest was huge, and Hugo was small. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long, confusing shadows. Hugo was tired, his tiny legs were aching, and he hadn't found a single glint of silver. Just then, he saw Bella the bluebird and Digby the mole. "Hugo!" Bella called out, fluttering down. "We're looking for the key." Have you seen it? If I fly high and Digby looks underground, we can cover more ground together. Hugo stiffened his quills. No thank you, he grunted. I can manage. I have a very sharp nose, you know. He kept walking, but the woods grew darker. Suddenly, Hugo's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss, and, whoosh, he tumbled down into a deep, narrow crevice between two jagged rocks. He wasn't hurt, but he was stuck. His prickles were wedged tight against the stone. He pushed and he pulled, but he couldn't move an inch. Help, he squeaked, his pride disappearing. Is anyone there? High above, Bella's sharp eyes caught the movement of a single shaking quill. She chirped loudly, signaling to Digby. In moments, they were at the edge of the crevice. Don't worry, Hugo, Digby shouted. He began to dig a small tunnel around the rock to loosen the earth, while Bella flew to find a sturdy vine. She dropped one end down to Hugo. Grab on with your paws, she chirped. With Digby loosening the soil and Bella pulling from above, Hugo finally popped out of the hole like a cork from a bottle. Hugo panted, smoothing down his messy quills. He looked at his friends. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I thought I could do everything alone. But I would still be in that hole if it wasn't for you. We're a team, Hugo, Digby said, patting his shoulder. And look. Digby pointed into the hole Hugo had just fallen into. There, tucked under a leaf at the very bottom, was the silver key. Hugo had fallen right on top of it. I found it. Hugo cheered. But we all rescued it. Together, the three friends carried the key back to the storehouse. Hugo realized that while being strong is good, being part of a team is even better. From that day on, Hugo never tried to move a big log or find a lost treasure alone. He knew that many paws, wings, and hearts working together could solve any problem in the Whispering Woods. Story 9. In the sun-drenched meadow at the edge of the Whispering Woods lived Pavo the peacock. Pavo was, without a doubt, the most magnificent-looking bird in the forest. His tail was a giant fan of emerald and gold, dotted with shimmering eyes that sparkled like jewels. Pavo spent every morning preening his feathers and every afternoon strutting past the other animals. Look at me, he would squawk. Am I not the very definition of beauty? One evening, a small, dusty brown bird landed on a low branch of the great willow. It was Naya the nightingale. She had no bright feathers, no golden crown, and no shimmering tail. She looked quite plain, like a small smooth stone among colorful flowers. Pavo looked up and let out a loud, mocking laugh. Oh, you poor little thing, he jeered, shaking his heavy tail so the feathers rattled. How dull you are. Don't you feel ashamed to sit so close to someone as spectacular as me? You have no colors at all. You are practically invisible. Naya didn't look sad. She simply tucked her small wings and waited for the silver moon to rise. As the forest grew quiet and the stars began to blink, Naya opened her tiny beak. A sound began to float through the air. It was a melody so pure, so sweet, and so full of magic that the wind itself stopped blowing to listen. The crickets stopped chirping, and the tired deer lifted their heads. The song spoke of starlight, of old memories, and of the peace of the woods. It was the most beautiful thing the animals had ever heard. Pavo stood frozen. He tried to let out his usual loud squawk to draw attention back to his feathers, but his voice was harsh and raspy. Compared to Naya's song, his squawk sounded like a rusty gate swinging in the wind. He realized that while everyone looked at his feathers, everyone listened to Naya's heart. The song ended, and the forest remained silent for a long moment in respect. You see, Pavo, the great owl whispered from above. Feathers are just a dress that fades in the dark. But a gift shared from the soul is a beauty that lasts forever. Pavo felt his pride melt away. He closed his grand tail and sat quietly. For the first time, he didn't want to be looked at, he wanted to listen. He learned that true beauty isn't what you see in the mirror, it's the kindness you show and the light you bring to others. From that night on, Pavo still kept his feathers clean, but he always made sure to leave the center stage for the little brown bird with the golden voice. Story 10. In the wide, grassy meadow that bordered the Whispering Woods lived a young colt named Caleb. Caleb was a beautiful chestnut color, but he had legs that felt a little bit too long and hooves that seemed to trip over every pebble. While the other young horses galloped gracefully across the fields, Caleb often found himself in a heap of tangled grass. "Oh, Caleb," the others would whinny, "you're as clumsy as a newborn fawn." One afternoon, the Great Meadow Games were announced. The prize was a wreath of golden clover from the Hidden Valley, a place high up in the craggy hills where only the surest-footed animals could go. Caleb wanted that clover more than anything. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just the clumsy one. When the race began, the other horses took off like lightning. Caleb started strong, but halfway up the rocky trail, his hoof slipped on a loose stone. Thud! He tumbled into the dirt. The other horses disappeared around the bend, their manes flowing like silk. Caleb sat there, his knees scraped and his heart heavy. "Maybe they're right," he sighed. "Maybe I should just stay in the flat grass." He watched a small mountain goat hopping nearby. The goat didn't move fast, it moved carefully. It placed one hoof down, checked the ground, and then moved the next. Caleb stood up and brushed the dust off his coat. He didn't try to gallop. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step. Clip. Then another. Clop. Every time he felt his balance wobble, he stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. As he climbed higher, the trail became narrow and twisted. He passed the faster horses one by one. They were huffing and puffing, stuck at a steep ledge they had tried to jump over too quickly. They had slipped and were too tired to try again. "It's too steep, Caleb," they called out. "Give up. If we can't do it, you certainly can't." Caleb didn't say a word. He kept his eyes on the path. He slipped twice more, but each time, he got right back up. He learned which rocks were sturdy and which ones were slippery. His legs felt like lead, and his breath came in short gasps, but he refused to stop. Finally, the air grew cool and sweet. Caleb stepped over the final ridge and gasped. There it was, the Hidden Valley, glowing green and gold in the afternoon sun. He was the only one there. He hadn't been the fastest, but he had been the one who kept going. When Caleb returned to the meadow with the golden clover wreath around his neck, the other horses were silent with shock. "How did you do it?" they asked. "We're much faster than you." Caleb smiled, his long legs standing firm and strong. "Speed only gets you to the hill," he said quietly. "But persistence gets you to the top. It doesn't matter how many times you fall, as long as you get up one more time than you went down." From that day on, no one called Caleb clumsy again. They called him Caleb the Constant, because they knew that once he started a journey, no mountain was high enough to stop him. Story 11. In the sunniest patch of the Whispering Woods lived Beatrice the bee. Beatrice was the busiest bee in the history of the hive. While the other bees took short breaks to wiggle their wings in the breeze, Beatrice was always zooming. Zee-zee-zee-zee-zee-zip. Zee-zee-zee-zee-zee-zoom. She carried the most pollen, visited the most daisies, and made the most honey. "Time is honey," she would buzz to anyone who would listen. No time to stop, no time to stare. One morning, the queen bee announced a special task. Somewhere in the deep thicket grows the midnight lily. It only blooms once every 7 years, and its nectar makes the sweetest, most golden honey in the world. Who will find it? Beatrice was out of the hive before the queen could even finish her sentence. Zoom! She flew over the sparkling stream. Zip! She darted past the great oak. She was moving so fast that the forest looked like a blurry green smear. She didn't see the colorful butterflies dancing. She didn't hear the babbling water. She didn't even smell the sweet wild roses. She was too busy looking for the big prize. She searched all day. She flew in circles, getting faster and faster. But she couldn't find the midnight lily anywhere. "It's not here," she grumbled, her tiny wings aching and her head spinning. The queen must be mistaken. Tired and frustrated, Beatrice landed on a small, mossy stone to catch her breath. For the first time all day, she sat perfectly still. She took a deep breath of the cool forest air. As her heart slowed down, she began to notice things. She noticed the soft, rhythmic hum of the grasshoppers. She noticed how the sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden spears. And then, she smelled it. A scent so delicate, so deep, and so magical that it made her antennae quiver. It wasn't a loud smell like the roses. It was a quiet, secret scent. Beatrice followed her nose, moving slowly and gently. She peeked behind a large, silver-gray fern that she had zoomed past 10 times already. There, tucked away in the quiet shadows, was the midnight lily. Its petals were as dark as the night sky and held a single, shimmering drop of nectar. "I found it," Beatrice whispered. She realized that she had missed it every time because she was moving too fast to see what was right in front of her. She took only what she needed and flew back to the hive, but this time, she didn't zoom. She glided. She watched the sunset turn the clouds pink. She waved to the dragonflies. When she returned, the queen was impressed. "How did you find it when so many others flew right past it?" Beatrice smiled. "I learned that when you are always rushing to the next flower, you miss the beauty of the one you are on. Sometimes, the fastest way to find what you're looking for is to stop and simply be where you are." From that day on, Beatrice was still a hard worker, but she always made time for a mindful minute. She learned that life isn't just a race to fill the honey pot, it's about enjoying every sweet drop along the way. Story 12. In the highest rafters of the old stone barn at the edge of the whispering woods lived Barnaby the Bat. Barnaby had velvet soft fur, tiny pointed ears, and wings that folded up like a dark silk umbrella. Most bats loved the night, but Barnaby was different. Every time the sun began to dip behind the trees, Barnaby's wings would start to tremble. "What if my sonar doesn't work?" he would whisper to his mom. "What if I fly into a giant oak tree or get tangled in the brambles? I'm just not as good at being a bat as the others." Barnaby lacked confidence. He spent his nights hanging by just one toe, watching his friends swoop and dive through the air like acrobats. They caught moths with ease and navigated the thickest branches without a single scratch. Barnaby felt like he was made of glass, ready to break at any moment. One Tuesday night, the moon decided to hide behind a thick curtain of indigo clouds. It was a pitch-black night, the kind where even the owls stayed home. The young bats were out practicing their mid-air turns when a sudden, cold wind began to howl through the valley. The wind was so strong it blew the younger bats off course, pushing them deep into the shadow canyons, a place where the echoes were loud and confusing. "We're lost," cried Finny, the fastest bat in the group. "The echoes are bouncing off everything. I can't tell which way is home." Barnaby, who had been watching from the barn door, felt a spark of worry in his chest. He knew the shadow canyons. He had studied the maps of the woods during the day when he was too afraid to fly at night. He knew every twist and turn by heart, even if he had never flown them. "I have to help them," Barnaby said, his voice small but steady. He let go of the rafter. Whoosh! For the first time, he didn't think about his shaky wings. He closed his eyes and let out a tiny, sharp click. The sound traveled out, hit a nearby weather vane, and bounced back to his ears. In his mind, a perfect map of the barn appeared. He flew into the dark night. Click, click, click. He could see the trees, the rocks, and the swirling wind. He reached the shadow canyons and found his friends huddled on a jagged ledge, terrified. "Follow my voice," Barnaby shouted over the wind. "I know the way. Trust me." Finny looked up. "Barnaby, but you're afraid of the shadows." "Not tonight," Barnaby replied. "Tonight, I'm the map." Barnaby led the way, sending out constant pulses of sound. He navigated them through the narrowest gaps and around the sharpest rocks. He flew with a grace he never knew he had, his wings flapping strong and sure. He didn't focus on the what-ifs, he focused on the right nows. When they finally tumbled back into the safety of the old stone barn, the other bats cheered. They gathered around Barnaby, their eyes wide with respect. "You saved us, Barnaby," Finny said. "You flew better than any of us." Barnaby tucked his wings in, but this time, he didn't tremble. He felt a warm glow of confidence spreading from his nose to his toes. He realized that confidence wasn't about knowing you'll never fall, it was about knowing you have the skills to get back up and find your way home. From that night on, Barnaby was the lead scout for the Whispering Woods Bat Colony. He learned that when you stop doubting your wings and start listening to your heart, you can fly through even the darkest night with ease. Story 13. In the quietest corner of the Whispering Woods, tucked between two ancient foxglove flowers, lived a tiny spider named Sylvia. Sylvia was a weaver of silver threads, and she was famous for one thing: she never, ever gave up. While the grasshoppers jumped from leaf to leaf and the dragonflies zoomed over the pond, Sylvia spent her days carefully placing one sticky thread at a time. One bright morning, Sylvia decided to build her masterpiece, the Great Star Web. It was going to be the largest, strongest, and most beautiful web the woods had ever seen, catching the morning dew like 1,000 tiny diamonds. She started at sunrise. Spin, stretch, anchor. She worked for hours, her 8 little legs moving in a perfect rhythm. By noon, the outer ring was finished. But just as she began to weave the delicate inner spirals, a playful breeze whistled through the ferns. Whoosh! A falling pine cone tumbled right through the center of her work, tearing the silver threads to pieces. The nearby crickets stopped chirping. "Oh, Sylvia," one sighed, "all that work for nothing. You should just go find a hole in a tree to sleep in. It's too windy today for a masterpiece." Sylvia didn't sigh. She didn't cry. She simply wiped her many eyes, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and started again. Spin, stretch, anchor. By the time the sun began to set, the web was almost finished again. It was even more beautiful than the first one. But then, a sudden summer rain shower began to fall. Drip, drop, splat. A giant raindrop hit the main anchor thread, and the weight of the water pulled the whole web down into a tangled, wet mess on the grass. "Give it up, Sylvia," called a passing snail. "Nature is against you today. Some things just aren't meant to be." Sylvia looked at her ruined work. Her legs were tired, and her silk was running low. But she looked up at the darkening sky and saw the first evening star blinking at her. "The star is still there," she whispered to herself. "So my star web must be there too." She waited for the rain to stop. In the silvery moonlight, while the rest of the woods went to sleep, Sylvia began for the 3rd time. She used the lessons she learned from the wind and the rain. She made the anchor threads thicker. She placed the spirals closer together. She worked through the night, guided by the soft glow of the fireflies. When the sun finally rose over the Whispering Woods, the animals gathered in silence. There, hanging between the foxgloves, was a web so magnificent it took their breath away. It had survived the morning breeze and the morning dew. It sparkled with a light that seemed to come from within. How did you do it? The crickets asked, amazed. We saw it break twice. Sylvia smiled a tiny spider smile. A web isn't made of just silk, she said softly. It's made of patience. Every time it breaks, I learn how to make the next thread stronger. The finish line doesn't move, you just have to keep walking toward it. That morning, the great star web caught more than just dew. It caught the hearts of everyone in the forest. Sylvia learned that greatness isn't about never failing, it's about having the heart to start over one more time than the world knocks you down. Story 14. Deep in a golden valley at the edge of the Whispering Woods lived Leo the lion. Leo was magnificent, with a mane that looked like a crown of sunbeams and a roar that could make the very leaves on the trees tremble. Because he was so big and so loud, the other animals were afraid of him. They would scurry away whenever they heard his heavy paws thumping on the grass. Leo was the king of the valley, but he was also the loneliest animal in the world. I wish I had a friend to watch the sunset with, Leo sighed one evening, his voice sounding like distant thunder. But everyone thinks I'm too scary. One afternoon, while Leo was napping under a shady acacia tree, a tiny field mouse named Monty was scurrying by. Monty was looking for a lost hazelnut and wasn't paying attention to where his pink nose was leading him. Before he knew it, Monty had climbed right onto Leo's massive, furry paw. Leo woke up with a start. He let out a giant yawn that showed his big, white teeth. He looked down and saw the shivering little mouse. Leo raised his heavy paw, trapping Monty in a cage of fur. Please, great king. Monty squeaked, his tiny heart beating like a butterfly's wings. Do not eat me. I am just a small mouse. If you let me go, I promise I will find a way to help you one day. Leo threw back his head and laughed. It was a deep, belly laugh that shook the ground. Help me. You. I am the strongest creature in the woods, and you are no bigger than a pebble. How could a tiny thing like you ever help a lion? But Leo was a kind king at heart. He saw the bravery in the little mouse's eyes and lifted his paw. Go on then, little one. Run along before I change my mind. Monty bowed low and vanished into the tall grass. A few weeks later, Leo was hunting near the great river when he stepped into a hidden trap set by humans. A thick, heavy rope net snapped shut, pulling Leo high into the air. He roared and thrashed, biting at the ropes and clawing at the air, but the more he struggled, the tighter the knots became. He was stuck, and he was terrified. The forest went silent. No animal dared to come near a trapped, angry lion. But then, a tiny voice drifted up from the ground. Don't worry, Leo. I'm here. It was Monty. He climbed up the trunk of the tree and scurried along the branch until he reached the thickest rope of the net. Without wasting a second, Monty began to gnaw. Crunch, nibble, crunch. His tiny teeth were sharp and fast. He chewed through one rope, then another, then a third. With a loud snap, the main knot gave way. The net fell apart, and Leo tumbled safely to the grass below. Leo stood up and shook his golden mane. He looked at the tiny mouse sitting on his shoulder. I was wrong, Monty, Leo said softly. I thought strength was only about big muscles and loud roars. But your heart is bigger than mine. You saved the king. From that day on, the most unusual pair could be seen wandering through the Whispering Woods. The great lion and the tiny mouse were inseparable. Leo learned that you should never judge a friend by their size, and Monty learned that even the scariest kings need a little kindness sometimes. They realized that true friendship isn't about being the same, it's about being there for each other when the world gets a little too tangled. Story 15. In the highest hollow of the oldest oak tree in the Whispering Woods lived Barnaby the owl. Barnaby was so old that his feathers were the color of silver mist, and his eyes looked like two glowing amber moons. Every animal in the forest came to Barnaby when they had a problem, from a tangled tale to a lost nut. Barnaby didn't just have knowledge, he had a quiet wisdom. One Tuesday night, something terrible happened. The animals gathered at the foot of the great oak, whispering in fear. "Barnaby! Barnaby! Wake up!" squeaked Sammy the squirrel. "The moon is gone. The sky is just a big, empty black hole." Barnaby blinked his heavy eyelids and looked up. It was true. Usually, the moon lit up the forest like a nightlight, but tonight, the sky was as dark as spilled ink. The rabbits were tripping over roots, and the deer were bumping into trees. Everyone was panicking. "A monster ate it," cried the frogs. "It fell into the ocean," wailed the foxes. Barnaby didn't panic. He didn't hoot in fear. He simply took a deep breath of the cool night air and closed his eyes. "Tell me," Barnaby said calmly, his voice like rustling leaves, "what else do you notice tonight? Use your noses and your ears, not just your eyes." The animals went silent. They sniffed the air. "It smells damp," said Daisy the deer. "Like wet stones." "The wind is cold," noted Toby the turtle. "And it sounds like a heavy blanket flapping." Barnaby nodded. "The moon hasn't been eaten, and it hasn't fallen. Look at the stars. Can you see them?" The animals looked up. "No," they whispered. "The stars are gone too." "If the stars and the moon are both gone," Barnaby explained, "then something is hiding them. A monster doesn't eat the stars and the moon at the same time." Just then, a tiny drop of water landed on Barnaby's beak. Plip. Then another. Plop. "It's the great mist clouds," Barnaby chuckled softly. "They have drifted down from the gray mountains to give the trees a drink. The moon is still there, right where it always is, sitting behind a big, fluffy gray blanket." As if on cue, the wind gave a giant whoosh, pushing the thick clouds aside. A sliver of silver light peeked through, then another, until the full, bright moon washed the forest in a beautiful glow. The missing moon was back. The animals felt very silly for being so scared. "We were so busy imagining monsters that we forgot to look at the clues," said Sammy. Barnaby smiled and tucked his head under his wing. "Remember," he whispered, "when a problem looks big and scary, don't let your fear do the talking. Stay quiet, look for the small signs, and you'll find that the answer was right in front of your nose all along." The woods grew quiet once more as the animals drifted off to sleep, feeling safe and wise, knowing that even on the darkest nights, the light is never really gone, it's just waiting for the clouds to pass. Story 16. High in the upper branches of the whispering woods lived Woody the woodpecker. Woody was a bird of many talents, with a bright red cap and a beak as strong as a blacksmith's hammer. He was the fastest drummer in the forest, and he made sure everyone knew it. Tap 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 tap. His rhythm was perfect, and his holes were the neatest circles anyone had ever seen. "Look at my work," Woody would chirp, puffing out his chest. "I am the architect of the trees. Without me, the birds would have no homes and the bugs would have nowhere to hide. I am the most important bird in the canopy." One afternoon, Woody found a massive, ancient cedar tree. It was tall and thick, but its wood was dry and tough. "I shall carve the greatest palace this forest has ever seen right in the side of this cedar," Woody declared. He didn't ask the tree for permission, and he didn't notice the moss growing on the north side, which usually meant the wood was very old and brittle. He began to drum. Bang! Bang! Crack! Woody was working so hard and so loudly that he didn't hear the warning creaks of the branches above. He was so focused on making his palace look grand that he ignored the advice of an old nuthatch who lived nearby. "Careful, Woody," the nuthatch whispered. "That cedar has seen many winters. It is hollow inside, and it needs its strength. Don't peck too deep." Woody tossed his red-capped head and laughed. I know more about wood than a tiny nuthatch. Watch and learn. He gave one final, massive thwack to the center of the trunk. But instead of a neat hole, there was a sickening crunch. The dry wood splintered, and a huge crack raced up the side of the tree. The palace Woody was building collapsed, and the branch he was standing on snapped right off. Woody tumbled through the air, his feathers ruffled and his pride stung, landing in a dusty heap at the bottom of the tree. His beautiful red cap was covered in cobwebs, and his beak felt very sore. Worst of all, the ancient cedar looked wounded and broken because of his vanity. "Oh no," Woody whispered, looking at the mess he had made. "I thought I was so great that I didn't have to listen to anyone." The other animals gathered around. They didn't laugh, but they didn't cheer either. They saw a bird who had forgotten that even the best drummer is nothing without the tree. Woody spent the next few days not drumming, but helping. He used his beak to clear away the splinters and brought soft moss to cover the crack in the cedar, helping the old tree heal. He listened to the nuthatch show him where the wood was soft and where it was strong. He learned that being important isn't about having the loudest drum or the grandest house. It's about respecting the world around you and knowing that you always have something new to learn. By the time the cedar was healed, Woody's rhythm had changed. It was softer, steadier, and much more beautiful. He realized that a true master doesn't need to shout about his skills, his work speaks for itself, and his heart stays humble enough to hear the secrets of the forest. Story 17. In a hidden corner of the Whispering Woods, where the wild lilies grow tall and the air smells of damp earth, lived a small skunk named Sam. Sam had the softest black fur and a bright, snowy white stripe that ran from his nose all the way to the tip of his bushy tail. But Sam was very, very shy. Whenever the other animals gathered for a game of tag or a forest feast, Sam would hide behind a large burdock leaf. "I'm just too much," Sam would whisper, his little nose twitching. "If I get too excited or if I get too scared, I might make a big, stinky smell. Everyone will laugh at me, and no one will want to be my friend." Every spring, the Whispering Woods held the Great Flower Festival. It was a day of dancing, singing, and wearing crowns made of petals. Sam loved flowers more than anything. He knew the difference between a snapdragon and a bluebell just by the way they swayed in the wind. But he never went to the festival. He stayed in his burrow, sniffing a single violet he had picked in secret. This year, the festival was being held in the sunlit glade. But just as the party began, a group of mischievous mountain goats wandered down into the valley. They weren't mean, but they were very hungry, and they started eating all the decorations. They ate the rose garlands, they chewed on the daisy chains, and they were heading straight for the rare orchid, the prize of the whole festival. "Oh no," cried Daisy the deer. "They're going to ruin everything. We can't push them away, they're too big." Sam was watching from behind his favorite leaf. He saw the goats getting closer to the beautiful orchids. His heart began to thump. Thump tap, thump tap. He was scared, but he was also sad to see the flowers disappearing. "I have to do something," Sam whispered. "Even if they laugh at me." Sam crept out from behind the leaf. He toddled into the middle of the glade, his white stripe glowing in the sun. The goats stopped chewing and looked down at the tiny skunk. They laughed. "What are you going to do, little one? Trip us with your tiny paws?" Sam didn't trip them. He didn't growl. Instead, he did what skunks do best when they are very, very determined. He turned around, lifted his fluffy tail, and he released a tiny, sharp cloud of his special skunk mist. It wasn't a huge cloud, but it was enough. The goats wrinkled their noses. "Yuck," they bleated. "What is that smell?" "It's like old socks and burnt rubber." The goats turned around and ran back toward the mountains as fast as their hooves could carry them. The forest went silent. Sam tucked his tail between his legs and started to scurry away, his ears hot with shame. Now they'll definitely hate me, he thought. Wait, Sam, called out Toby the turtle. Sam stopped. He looked back and saw the animals cheering. They weren't holding their noses, they were clapping their paws. You saved the orchids, shouted Leo the lion. That was amazing. We didn't know you had such a powerful secret weapon. Sam blinked his big, dark eyes. You're not mad about the smell? Of course not, said Daisy the deer, placing a crown of jasmine on Sam's head. It's a part of who you are, Sam. And today, it was exactly what we needed. We like you just the way you are, stripe, smell, and all. That afternoon, Sam didn't hide behind a leaf. He danced in the middle of the glade, wearing his flower crown with pride. He learned that the things that make us feel different are often the very things that make us special. From that day on, Sam realized that true friends don't mind a little stink when it comes from a heart made of gold. Story 18. In the brushiest thicket of the Whispering Woods lived Felix the fox. Felix had a coat the color of autumn leaves and a tail so fluffy it looked like a giant orange marshmallow. Felix was very fast and very clever, but he had one big problem. He was incredibly forgetful. He was the kind of fox who would hide a delicious blueberry muffin and then forget which bush he put it under 5 minutes later. I don't need to write things down, Felix would brag to the squirrels. My brain is like a library. I remember everything. But the truth was, Felix's library was a bit of a mess. His shelves were full of half-finished ideas and where did I put that thoughts. As the first frost began to sparkle on the grass, the great winter map was drawn. This was a special map that showed where the emergency food shelters were hidden, just in case the snow got too deep. The forest warden, Barnaby the Badger, gave a copy to Felix. Keep this safe, Felix, Barnaby warned. The north wind is coming, and if the landmarks get covered in white, this map is the only way to find the golden acorn cache. Felix nodded solemnly. You can count on me, Barnaby. It's safe in my den. Felix took the map home. He looked at his messy den. There were piles of shiny smooth stones, half-chewed twigs, and a collection of colorful feathers scattered everywhere. I'll just tuck it, here, Felix said, sliding the map under a pile of dried moss near his sleeping spot. A week later, the great snow arrived. It didn't just fall, it dumped. The forest turned into a giant, white marshmallow world. The bushes disappeared, the paths vanished, and even the great oak looked different in its heavy white coat. Sammy the squirrel and Pip came knocking at Felix's door. Felix. The snow is up to our tummies. We can't find the golden acorn cache, and we're so hungry. Do you have the map? Of course. Felix chirped. He ran to the corner of his den and started digging. He pulled up the moss. No map. He looked under his stone collection. No map. He checked behind his feather pile. Nothing. I know it's here somewhere, Felix muttered, his ears drooping. He tossed feathers and stones everywhere, making an even bigger mess. The more he looked, the more panicked he felt. Sammy and Pip watched with wide, worried eyes. We're going to be very cold and very hungry if we don't find it, Pip whispered, shivering. Felix felt a lump in his throat. His messiness wasn't just his problem anymore, it was hurting his friends. He took a deep breath and sat down. I'm so sorry, he said. I thought I was too clever for a system, but now I've lost the most important thing in the woods. Just then, he saw a tiny corner of parchment peeking out from inside an old hollow log he used as a footstool. He grabbed it. It was the map. The three friends followed the map through the snow, using the secret landmarks like the jagged rock and the twisted willow. They found the cache, filled their bellies, and stayed warm all night. The next morning, Felix didn't go out to play in the snow. He stayed in his den. He cleared out the old twigs. He lined up his stones by size. And right in the center of his wall, he used a sharp thorn to pin the winter map where he could see it every single day. From now on, Felix told Barnaby the next time they met, "I'm not just clever. I'm organized." Because a map you can't find is just a piece of paper, but a map in its place is a lifesaver. Felix learned that being smart is good, but being prepared is even better. His den became the tittiest spot in the Whispering Woods, and he never lost a blueberry muffin, or a map, ever again. Story 19. In the slowest, muddiest part of the sparkling stream lived a turtle named Titus. Titus had a shell as hard as a brick and a face that looked like it was carved out of a grumpy old potato. While the other animals in the Whispering Woods were busy celebrating the arrival of spring, Titus was busy complaining. "The sun is too bright," Titus would grumble, pulling his head halfway into his shell. "The birds are too loud. And don't even get me started on the mud, it's far too squishy this year." Titus was a glass half empty kind of turtle. If it rained, he complained about the damp. If it was sunny, he complained about the heat. He carried his grumpiness around like a second shell, and eventually, the other animals stopped inviting him to the Friday forest feast because he always found something wrong with the berry pie. One afternoon, a young river otter named Otto came sliding down the muddy bank. Whoosh! Splat! Otto landed right in front of Titus, covered from head to tail in thick, goopy gray mud. Otto looked like a swamp monster with whiskers. Titus scowled. Typical. No respect for the quiet. Now you've splashed mud on my freshly polished shell. This day is officially ruined. But Otto didn't look upset. He looked at his muddy paws, then at his muddy reflection in the water, and let out a giant, barking giggle. "Did you see that, Titus? I did a triple spin flip. I look like a chocolate-covered marshmallow." Titus blinked. "You're covered in dirt, Otto. It's messy. It's cold. What's so funny? The mess is the best part." Otto laughed, shaking himself dry and sending a spray of mud onto a nearby fern. "If I only looked at the mud, I'd be sad. But if I look at the slide, I'm the luckiest otter in the woods." It's all about the story you tell yourself, Titus. Titus sat very still. He looked at the mud on his own shell. Usually, he would have spent the rest of the day fuming. But he looked at Otto's wide, toothy grin and felt a strange tickle in his chest. It started as a tiny bubble, then it turned into a wheeze, and finally, ha ha ha, Titus let out a dry, rusty laugh. It was the first time he had laughed in 10 years. I suppose I do look a bit like a muddy boulder," Titus chucked. Suddenly, the sun didn't feel too hot, it felt warm and cozy. The birds didn't sound loud, they sounded like a grand orchestra. Titus realized that his grumpiness hadn't been protecting him, it had been a cage. The world hadn't changed, but his story had. He spent the rest of the afternoon practicing mudsliding with Otto. He wasn't very fast, and he got very, very dirty, but he didn't complain once. When the Friday forest feast rolled around, Titus showed up with a big bowl of water lilies and a giant smile. "The pie is a bit tart," he said to the baker, "but the crust is the flakiest I've ever tasted. Thank you for the treat." The other animals were so happy to have the new Titus around that they gave him an extra scoop of berries. Titus learned that while you can't always control the weather or the mud, you can always choose to find the laughter in the middle of the mess. From that day on, Titus was known as the jovial journaler of the woods, always ready with a joke and a reminder that every muddy puddle has a silver lining. Story 20. In the deepest, most shadowed thickets of the Whispering Woods lived a young wolf named Wilder. Wilder had a coat the color of wood smoke and eyes like twin golden lanterns. While the other wolves in his pack loved to hunt together and howl in a grand, loud chorus, Wilder was a wanderer. He often found himself staring at the distant blue mountains, wondering if there was a place where the trees grew taller and the air tasted sweeter. "I don't think I belong here," Wilder whispered to the wind one evening. "I'm too quiet for the pack, and I'm too restless for the den. I need to find my true home." One moonless night, Wilder decided to leave. He didn't say goodbye, and he didn't look back. He ran past the sparkling stream, through the great meadow, and began to climb the rocky slopes of the Blue Mountains. At first, it was exciting. Everything was new. The rocks were jagged and silver, and the wind sang a high, lonely song. "This is it," Wilder thought, his tail wagging. "This is where a wolf like me belongs." But as the days turned into weeks, the excitement began to fade. The Blue Mountains were beautiful, but they were also very cold. There were no squirrels to chase, no soft moss to sleep on, and most importantly, there was no one to answer his howl. When Wilder howled at the mountain peaks, his voice just bounced back to him, cold and empty. One evening, a fierce blizzard rolled in. The snow was so thick Wilder couldn't see his own paws. He found a small, shivering cave, but it felt like a tomb. He was hungry, his paws were cracked from the ice, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly small. Suddenly, through the howling wind, he heard a sound. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a mountain goat. It was a faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump. Wilder crept to the edge of the cave. Far below, in the valley of the Whispering Woods, he saw a tiny, flickering light. It was the glow of the fireflies and the warm lanterns of the beaver dams. And then, he heard it, a long, low, beautiful howl. It was his pack. They weren't hunting, they were calling. "Ayo! Wilder! Come home!" In that moment, Wilder realized something he had never understood before. Home isn't a coordinate on a map or a mountain with a better view. Home is the place where people notice when you're gone. It's the place where your voice doesn't just echo, it fits. Wilder didn't wait for the storm to pass. He used his strong legs to leap down the mountainside. He ran until his lungs burned and his fur was soaked with melted snow. When he finally broke through the tree line of the Whispering Woods, the pack was waiting. They didn't scold him for leaving. They simply circled around him, their warm fur pressing against his cold sides. "We missed your quiet howl, Wilder," his mother said, licking his ear. "The chorus wasn't right without you." Wilder laid his head on the mossy ground and closed his eyes. He still loved to wander, and he still looked at the mountains sometimes, but he did it from the safety of the great oak. He learned that you don't have to be exactly like everyone else to belong. You just have to be there for the ones who would go looking for you in the dark. From that day on, Wilder was known as the Watchman of the Woods. He traveled far to see new things, but he always returned by moonrise, knowing that the best part of any journey is the path that leads you back to the hearts that love you. Story 21. In the sun-dappled meadow near the edge of the Whispering Woods, a small green caterpillar named Pip spent his days munching on milkweed leaves. Pip was a dreamer. While the other caterpillars were content with the taste of the next leaf, Pip would often pause, looking up at the sky where the dragonflies sipped and the swallows soared. One day, Pip would whisper to his friend, a beetle named Barnaby, "I am going to touch the clouds. I'm going to see the top of the great oak without having to crawl for 3 days." Barnaby would just chuckle, his shiny black shell shaking. "Pip, you have 16 tiny legs and a very round tummy. You were built for munching, not for soaring. Be happy with your leaf, it's a very good leaf." But Pip couldn't help it. He felt a strange pull in his heart, a feeling that he was meant for something more than just crawling. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he kept his dream tucked away like a secret seed. One chilly autumn afternoon, Pip felt a sudden heaviness. He didn't want to munch anymore. He felt a deep, sleepy urge to find a quiet branch and stay very still. He climbed a sturdy twig on a wild rosebush and began to spin. He spun a house of silk, thick and green, until he was completely tucked away from the wind and the world. Inside the darkness of his cocoon, Pip felt himself changing. It was scary at first. He felt like he was falling apart, losing his 16 legs and his round tummy. Is this the end of my dream? He wondered. But even in the dark, he held on to the memory of the blue sky. He realized that to become something new, he had to let go of who he used to be. Weeks passed. The snow fell and melted, and the first buds of spring began to peek through the soil. Inside the silk house, a new Pip was ready. He pushed against the walls of his cocoon. It was hard work, the hardest work he had ever done. He pushed and he wiggled until, pop, the silk tore open. He crawled out onto the branch, but he didn't feel the rough bark on his tummy. He felt light. He felt powerful. He reached back and felt two magnificent, orange and black wings unfolding like a royal cape. He wasn't a caterpillar anymore, he was a monarch butterfly. With a single flap, he lifted off the branch. He didn't crawl, he danced on the breeze. He flew over the meadow, past a very surprised Barnaby the beetle, and kept going until he reached the very top of the great oak. From high above, the whispering woods looked like a beautiful green puzzle. Pip realized that his dream hadn't been a silly fantasy, it was his destiny. He learned that change can be quiet and a little bit scary, but if you have the courage to grow, you can turn a slow crawl into a spectacular flight. Story 22. In the sunniest corner of the Whispering Woods lived a young squirrel named Pip. Pip was smaller than the other squirrels, with a tail that was more of a fuzz than a plume. Because he was small, the older squirrels, led by a boisterous fellow named Buster, often gathered the best acorns before Pip could even reach the branches. "Don't worry, little Pip," Buster would bark, tossing a half-eaten shell at him. "Wait for the leftovers. You're too small to carry the big ones anyway. You'll just trip over your own paws." Pip hated waiting for leftovers. He wanted to be the one to find the Grand Harvest acorn, a legendary nut said to grow on the ancient high ridge, so big it could feed a whole family for a week. One crisp October morning, Pip decided he was done waiting. He didn't ask Buster for help, and he didn't wait for the group. He packed a tiny moss satchel and began the long climb toward the high ridge. The path was steep, and the wind up there whistled like a hungry wolf. His tiny legs ached, and more than once, he slipped on the loose shale. Buster was right, Pip whispered, shivering. "I'm just a small squirrel in a very big mountain." But then, he remembered his grandfather's words, "A small squirrel with a plan is stronger than a big squirrel with a loud mouth." Pip stopped trying to leap over the boulders. Instead, he looked for the tiny cracks where his small paws fit perfectly. He found a secret path behind a waterfall that the bigger squirrels were too wide to squeeze through. He used his light weight to skitter across thin branches that would have snapped under Buster's heavy feet. Finally, at the very peak of the ridge, he saw it. The Grand Harvest acorn. It was magnificent, deep gold, smooth as polished glass, and nearly as big as Pip himself. "I found it!" Pip cheered. But then he looked at the steep path back down. "How am I going to get this home? I can't carry it, and if I roll it, it might smash into the rocks." Pip sat and thought. He didn't give up. He looked at the long, dried vines hanging from the ridge. He used his sharp teeth to weave a sturdy net, tied the acorn inside, and attached it to a flat, smooth piece of bark. He had made a sled. Slowly and carefully, Pip steered his sled down the mountain. He used the vines like reins, guiding the heavy nut through the narrow gaps he had found earlier. When he finally skated into the main clearing of the Whispering Woods, the entire squirrel colony gasped. Buster dropped the small nut he was holding, his jaw hanging open. You got the grand harvest acorn." Buster stuttered. "But you're so small." "Who helped you?" Pip stood tall, his fuzzy tail twitching with pride. "No one helped me, Buster. I used my own paws, my own path, and my own brain. I may be small, but I found out that I'm plenty big enough to take care of myself." From that day on, no one called Pip little. They called him Pip the Pioneer. He learned that self-reliance isn't about being the biggest or the strongest, it's about trusting your own rhythm and finding your own way, even when the mountain looks too high to climb. Story 23. In the swiftest, greenest meadow of the Whispering Woods lived a hare named Hops. Hops was famous for his speed, his back legs were like coiled springs, and he could cross the entire valley before the sun moved a single inch across the sky. But Hops was also very busy. Can't stop, got places to be. Feet to move. Grass to crush, he would shout as he blurred past the other animals. One scorching summer afternoon, the sparkling stream began to run dry. The rocks grew hot, and the flowers began to droop their thirsty heads. The animals were worried. "If we don't find water soon," sighed Daisy the deer, "the meadow will turn to dust." Hops was zooming toward the cool blue mountains when he saw an old tortoise named Terence. Terence was moving so slowly he looked like a stationary rock. He was panting, his shell dusty and dry. "Move it or lose it, Terence." Hops shouted, skidding to a stop. "I'm heading to the high peaks to find a glacier. I'll be back in a flash with a belly full of cold water." Terence looked up with tired eyes. "Hops, wait. My grandfather told me of a hidden river right here in the valley, tucked beneath the great ferns. But I am too slow to find the entrance before the sun sets, and the others are too weak to dig." Hops looked at the shimmering heat waves on the horizon. He could easily run to the mountains. He could save himself and be back before dinner. But then he looked at Terence's cracked shell and Daisy's wilted flower crown. "The mountains are for me," Hops whispered, "but the hidden river is for everyone." For the first time in his life, Hops didn't run. He stayed. "Show me where to look, Terence," he said, his voice steady. Hops used his powerful back legs not for running, but for digging. Thump scuff thump. He kicked away the dry earth beneath the great ferns. He dug through the red clay and the tangled roots. The sun beat down on his neck, and his fur grew heavy with sweat, but he didn't stop. He wasn't thinking about how fast he was thinking about how thirsty his friends were. Suddenly, a cool, damp smell filled the air. Gurgle, splash. A crystal-clear stream of water burst from the ground, bubbling up from the hidden river. It spilled over the rocks, filling the hollows and soaking into the thirsty roots of the meadow. The animals let out a collective cheer. They splashed in the cool water, their spirits lifting as the flowers began to stand tall again. Terence hobbled over and took a long, slow drink. "Thank you, Hops. You could have been halfway to the mountains by now." Hops smiled, sitting down and letting the water soak his tired paws. "I realized that being the fastest doesn't matter if you're running away from the people who need you. Sometimes, the best use for a pair of fast legs is staying exactly where you are to help a friend." From that day on, Hops was still the fastest hare in the woods, but he always made sure to check the slow lane first. He learned that compassion is a much better fuel than speed, and that a hidden river is only found by those who stop long enough to listen to the needs of others. Story 24. In the damp, leafy heart of the Whispering Woods lived Flick, a tiny firefly with a light that was more of a faint shimmer than a brilliant glow. While the older fireflies, led by a flashy fellow named Glimmer, loved to put on grand light shows that looked like falling stars, Flick usually stayed near the low ferns. "Watch and learn, kid," Glimmer would shout, pulsing a rhythmic, blinding gold. Leadership is about being the brightest thing in the sky. If they can't see you from the great oak, you're just a bug in the rug. Flick didn't want to be the brightest, he just wanted to make sure the snails didn't get stepped on in the dark. He spent his time practicing a steady, low hum of light, soft enough not to startle the sleeping moths, but clear enough to show the way. One autumn evening, a thick gray fog rolled in from the misty marshes. This wasn't a normal fog, it was heavy, wet, and smelled of old willow bark. It swallowed the trees, the bushes, and even the stars. The great firefly parade was supposed to lead the forest creatures to the harvest hollow, but Glimmer and the Bright Brigade were in trouble. "I can't see my own wings," Glimmer cried, his brilliant gold light bouncing off the thick fog like a mirror. The brighter he pulsed, the more the fog blinded him. The light was so sharp it created white walls of mist, leaving the deer and the rabbit spinning in circles, lost and afraid. Flick hovered near a mossy rock. He saw the panic. He didn't try to outshine the fog. Instead, he dropped low, right to the forest floor where the air was just a little bit clearer. He turned on his soft, steady shimmer. "Follow the glow on the grass," Flick called out, his voice small but calm. "Don't look up at the mist. Look down at the moss." Because Flick's light was gentle, it didn't bounce back or create a blinding glare. It cut through the base of the fog like a small, golden needle. One by one, the animals saw the soft amber trail. The deer lowered their heads, the rabbits twitched their noses, and even the grumpy old bears followed the tiny spark. Flick didn't fly fast. He stayed at the front, pausing every few steps to make sure the slowest turtle was still with them. He wasn't a falling star in the sky, he was a lantern on the path. When they finally reached the clear air of the harvest hollow, the animals let out a cheer that shook the acorns from the trees. Glimmer landed nearby, his light dim and his wings drooping. "I thought being a leader meant being the loudest and the brightest," he whispered. "A real leader isn't the one who shines the most," said Barnaby the owl, looking down at Flick. "A real leader is the one who finds the path when everyone else is lost. You didn't try to show off, Flick, you just tried to be helpful." Flick's little light pulsed with a warm, humble glow. He learned that true leadership isn't about standing in the spotlight, it's about being the light that helps others find their way through the fog. From that night on, whenever the mists rolled in, the woods didn't look for the brightest flash, they looked for the steady, soft shimmer of the firefly who cared. Story 25. In the highest, leafiest branch of the silver birch lived Midas the magpie. Midas had feathers that shimmered like oil on water, deep purples, greens, and blues, but his heart was set on things that shimmered even brighter. Midas was a collector. His nest wasn't made of just twigs and moss, it was woven with candy wrappers, soda tabs, and bits of broken mirror. "If it glitters, it's mine," Midas would cackle, hopping from branch to branch. "The more I have, the more important I am. Look at my hoard. Am I not the richest bird in the whispering woods?" One morning, after a heavy rain, Midas spotted something extraordinary near the sparkling stream. It was a large glass marble, lost by a child weeks ago. In the morning sun, it glowed with a swirling blue center, looking like a trapped piece of the ocean. "Mine!" Midas shrieked, diving down. He scooped it up, but the marble was heavy and smooth. He had to clench his beak tight just to hold it. As he flew back toward his nest, he passed Squeak the field mouse. Squeak was shivering under a wet dock leaf. "Oh, Midas!" Squeak called out. "The rain flooded my burrow and washed away my winter seeds. Do you have a spare bit of cracker or a shiny foil wrapper I could use to roof my new home?" Midas didn't answer. He couldn't, his beak was full of the heavy marble. He just let out a muffled grump and kept flying. Next, he saw Bella the bluebird. She was trying to build a nest for her new eggs, but the wind was blowing her dry grass away. Midas, you have so many colorful strings and ribbons in your nest. Could I borrow just one to tie my twigs together? Midas looked at his nest, overflowing with treasures he never used. He thought about his ribbons. But then he looked at the blue marble in his beak. If I give her a ribbon, I'll have one less thing, he thought. He shook his head and hopped further up the tree. That night, a great wind began to howl through the whispering woods. Midas sat in his nest, surrounded by his wealth. But the nest was slippery with plastic and metal. It wasn't warm, and it wasn't sturdy. Because he had refused to help Squeak and Bella, he was all alone when the branches began to sway. Crack! A heavy gust hit the silver birch. Midas's nest, too heavy with junk and not tied down with care, slid right off the branch. My treasures! Midas cried, fluttering his wings. He reached for the blue marble, but it rolled away, vanishing into the dark, muddy bushes below. All his foil, his wrappers, and his glass shards were scattered to the wind. Midas sat on a bare branch, cold and empty-handed. He had nothing. The next morning, he heard a cheerful sound. He looked down and saw Bella's nest. It was strong and cozy, tied together with colorful threads that Squeak had found in the meadow. Squeak was there too, sitting under a sturdy roof made of a discarded tin lid they had found together. They were sharing a feast of dried berries and laughing. Midas felt a strange pinch in his chest. It wasn't hunger, it was loneliness. He flew down, feeling very small. I lost everything, he whispered. Bella looked up. She didn't scold him. She pulled a long, red string from the edge of her nest, one that Midas recognized from his own hoard. The wind blew this to me last night, Midas. I was going to use it, but I think you need it to start your new home. Squeak pushed a small pile of seeds toward him. Eat first. Building a home is hard work when you're hungry. Midas looked at the string and the seeds. He realized that his treasures had only made his nest heavy and his heart hard. The real wealth wasn't the things he kept for himself, it was the kindness his neighbors were willing to share. Midas didn't go looking for the blue marble. Instead, he spent the day helping Squeak clear the mud from his burrow. He used his strong wings to carry heavy twigs for the other birds. He learned that a nest made of friendship is much warmer than one made of glass and gold. From on, Midas was still a collector, but now, he only collected things he could give away. And strangely enough, the more he gave, the lighter he felt, and the higher he could fly. Story 26. In the deepest bend of the sparkling stream, where the water usually hummed a busy tune, lived Barnaby the beaver. Barnaby was not the fastest swimmer, and he wasn't the strongest tree feller, but he was certainly the most patient. While the other young beavers spent their summer afternoons splashing in the shallows or playing tag the trout, Barnaby was always working on his dam. "Barnaby, come play," called out Biff, a beaver with a very flat tail and very little focus. "The sun is out, the lilies are sweet, and the water is perfect. Why are you still piling up those heavy stones and thick mud?" Barnaby wiped his brow with a wet paw. "The stream is high now, Biff, but the wise old owl says the great heat is coming. If we don't strengthen the walls and deepen the pool today, we won't have any water to swim in tomorrow." Biff just laughed, sending a spray of water into the air. "Tomorrow is a long way off. I'm living for today." And with a giant slap of his tail, he vanished into the reeds. Barnaby sighed but didn't stop. He spent his days carefully selecting the sturdiest willow branches. He didn't just toss them together, he wove them like a basket, packing the gaps with thick, blue clay from the riverbed. He dug deeper into the mud at the bottom, making the pond behind his dam much deeper than it needed to be for the current season. Weeks passed, and the sun grew larger and hotter. The great heat arrived just as the owl had predicted. The green leaves turned brown and curled like old parchment. The sparkling stream, once a rushing river, slowed to a tiny, muddy trickle. Most of the beaver dams in the Whispering Woods began to fail. Without deep pools, the water evaporated, leaving the beaver lodges sitting high and dry in the baking sun. Biff's dam, which had been built quickly with loose sticks and light mud, crumbled into a pile of dry tinder. "I'm so thirsty," Biff groaned, sitting on a sun-baked rock. "My lodge is full of ants, and the water is gone. What are we going to do?" Just then, they heard a familiar glug-glug splash. They followed the sound to Barnaby's bend. To their amazement, Barnaby's pond was still full of cool, dark water. His dam stood tall and strong, holding back every precious drop that trickled down from the mountains. Because he had dug the pond deep, the sun couldn't reach the bottom to dry it up. "Barnaby!" Biff gasped, sliding into the refreshing water. "How is your pond still here?" "It's like magic." Barnaby smiled, floating on his back. "It's not magic, Biff. It's planning. While the sun was shining, I was thinking about the shade. While the water was plenty, I was thinking about the drought. I didn't just build for the now, I built for the whenever." Barnaby didn't keep the water for himself. He invited all the thirsty animals, the deer, the rabbits, and even the grumpy old turtles, to share his pool. He spent the rest of the summer teaching Biff and the others how to weave their branches tighter and dig their ponds deeper. He learned that the best time to fix a leaky roof is when the sun is shining, and the best time to save for a dry season is when the rain is falling. From that day on, the beavers of the Whispering Woods were never caught unprepared again. They realized that a little bit of patience and a lot of planning could turn a summer disaster into a cool, refreshing success. Story 27. In a lush, muddy bend of the great river that bordered the Whispering Woods lived Hugo the hippo. Hugo was a mountain of a creature, with skin the color of river stones and a yawn so wide it looked like an opening to a dark cave. Because Hugo was so massive, the smaller animals often stayed far away. When he stepped into the water, it created waves that rocked the lily pads, and when he let out a huff, it sounded like a steam engine. "I wish I could help the others," Hugo sighed, blowing bubbles in the water. "But I'm too heavy for the branches and too big for the burrows. I just feel like a giant accident waiting to happen." One afternoon, a tiny oxpecker bird named Pip was fluttering near the riverbank. Pip was bright and fast, but he was also very distracted by a particularly shiny beetle. Zing! Pip dove for the beetle, but he didn't see the thick, sticky spiderweb stretched across the tall reeds. In a flash, Pip was tangled. The more he flapped his delicate, papery wings, the tighter the sticky silk wrapped around him. "Help!" Pip chirped, his voice no louder than a blade of grass rustling. "I'm stuck. And the sun is getting too hot." Hugo, who was resting nearby with only his eyes and ears peeking out of the water, heard the tiny distress call. He rose from the river like a slow-moving island. Splosh! The other birds flew away in a panic. "Watch out! Hugo is coming. He'll crush the reeds," they cried. Hugo moved with incredible care. He didn't run. He placed each massive, four-toed foot exactly where the mud was firmest. He reached the reeds where Pip was trapped. The spiderweb was so small compared to Hugo's giant snout that it looked like a single strand of hair. "Stay very still, little friend," Hugo rumbled, his voice low and vibrating like a purr. Hugo didn't use his teeth, and he didn't use his heavy feet. Instead, he used his thick, velvety lips. With the gentlest touch, so soft it didn't even bend the reed, he nudged the silk. He used his warm breath to soften the sticky threads and then, with a tiny, precise movement, he pulled the webbing away from Pip's wings. Pip felt the pressure vanish. He gave his wings a shake, and, pop, he was free. He soared into the air, circling Hugo's head in a joyful dance. "You did it, Hugo," Pip chirped, landing right on the hippo's broad, flat nose. "You're as gentle as a butterfly." Hugo blinked his long lashes, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I thought my strength was only for pushing and splashing. I didn't know it could be used for quiet things too." From that day on, Hugo and Pip became the best of friends. Pip would sit on Hugo's back, picking away the itchy bugs, and Hugo would act as a steady, floating island for all the small birds of the river. Hugo learned that true strength isn't just about how much you can lift or how loud you can roar. It's about having the power to be dangerous, but the heart to be gentle. He realized that the biggest animals can have the softest touch, and that even a giant can find a place to belong in the tiniest parts of the woods. Story 28. In the softish, clover-filled patch of the Whispering Woods lived a young rabbit named Bink. Bink had long, silky ears that twitched at the slightest sound and a nose that wiggled like a pink jelly bean. While his brothers and sisters loved to explore the deep, winding tunnels of the family warren, Bink preferred to stay near the front porch, the patch of grass just outside the main entrance. "Come on, Bink," his sister Bella would call, her voice echoing from deep underground. "We found a secret chamber full of glowing moss. It looks like a room full of emeralds." Bink would just shake his head, his ears flopping. "No thank you. It's too dark down there. What if the ceiling falls? What if there are shadow monsters with long, pointy fingers? I'll stay here where I can see the sun." Bink had a fear of the unknown. To him, the dark wasn't just an absence of light, it was a place where his imagination built scary stories. He felt safe in the bright meadow, but every time the sun began to set, he would scramble into the very first room of the burrow and hide under a pile of dried straw. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled over the woods. Boom! The thunder cracked like a giant wooden drum. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the rain began to fall in heavy, silver buckets. The meadow quickly turned into a shallow lake. "Everyone into the deep gallery," the rabbit elder commanded. "The water is rising. We must go to the high chamber at the very bottom of the hill." The rabbits scurried down, their paws thumping on the packed dirt. But in the rush, Bink's favorite younger brother, Buttons, tripped over a stray root. He tumbled into a side tunnel, one that hadn't been used in years, and got his foot stuck in a narrow gap between two stones. "Help!" Buttons squeaked. "It's dark and I can't move." The storm was so loud that only Bink, who was trailing behind, heard the tiny cry. He looked at the main tunnel, where the warm glow of the family lanterns beckoned. Then he looked at the pitch-black side tunnel. His heart felt like a trapped bird fluttering in his chest. "I can't go in there," Bink whispered, his legs shaking. "The shadows, the monsters." But then he heard Buttons sob. It was a small, lonely sound. Bink realized that his brother was more scared than he was. "I'm coming, Buttons," Bink shouted. He didn't have a lantern. He didn't have a map. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second, and hopped into the darkness. At first, his mind tried to play its old tricks. Every rustle sounded like a growl, every drip of water felt like a cold finger. But as Bink moved deeper, he realized something. The air was cool and smelled of sweet, damp earth. The walls were smooth and solid. There were no monsters, only silence. He followed the sound of Buttons breathing. Sniff huff, sniff huff. Bink reached the stones and used his strong back legs to brace himself. "Push with me, Buttons. 1, 2, 3, heave." With a loud thud, the stone moved. Buttons was free. The two brothers huddled together in the dark. "Bink, you saved me," Buttons whispered. "But aren't you afraid of the dark anymore?" Bink looked around. He couldn't see much, but he could feel the safety of the earth around them. "I realize that the dark is just a place waiting for a light," Bink said. "And if I don't have a lantern, I can be my own light by being brave." The two rabbits navigated their way back to the high chamber, where the rest of the family welcomed them with nuzzles and warm clover tea. Bink didn't hide under the straw that night. He sat in the middle of the deep burrow, listening to the stories of the elders. He learned that fear is often just a shadow cast by a worried mind. When you face the thing that scares you, the shadow disappears, leaving you with the strength you never knew you had. From that day on, Bink was the first one to explore the new tunnels, knowing that the most beautiful secrets of the woods are often hidden in the places where the sun doesn't shine. Story 29. In the highest, windiest branch of the ironwood tree lived Casper the Crow. Casper was not like the other birds. His feathers weren't just black. They had a polished sheen like a beetle's back, and his eyes were as sharp as two obsidian beads. While the younger crows spent their time chasing each other or cawing at the farm dogs, Casper spent his time watching. Observation, Casper would tell his nephews, is the best tool in your nest. If you watch long enough, the world will tell you all its secrets. One afternoon, a traveler passing through the whispering woods sat down by the sparkling stream to eat his lunch. When he stood up to leave, a small, silver key fell from his pocket and landed right in a narrow crack between two heavy river stones. The traveler didn't notice and walked away, leaving the silver key glinting in the shadows. Midas the magpie saw it first. "Shiny! Mine!" he shrieked, diving down. He tried to reach into the crack with his beak, but the opening was too thin. He tried to move the stones, but they were wedged tight by the mud. He scratched and he pulled, but the key stayed exactly where it was. "It's impossible." Midas huffed, his feathers ruffled in frustration. "The stones are too heavy and the hole is too deep. No one can get that treasure." Buster the squirrel tried next. He stuck his tiny arm into the crack, but his fur got caught on the rough edges of the stone. He tried to dig around the base, but the ground was full of thick, stubborn roots. "Give it up, Midas," Buster squeaked. It stuck forever. Casper the Crow had been watching from the ironwood tree. He didn't dive down right away. He hopped onto a lower branch and tilted his head, looking at the stones from the left, then from the right. He noticed three things. The crack was narrow, the key had a small loop at the end, and there were several stiff, hooked twigs lying under a nearby large tree. Casper flew down. He didn't scratch at the stones. He walked over to the large tree and selected a very specific twig, one that was thin, strong, and had a natural little hook at the very tip. "What are you doing, Casper?" Midas mocked. "That twig isn't strong enough to move those rocks." "I don't need to move the rocks," Casper said calmly. "I just need to move the key." Casper hopped back to the river stones. He held the twig firmly in his beak and carefully slid it into the narrow crack. He didn't rush. He moved the twig slowly, feeling for the metal. Clink! He felt the hook catch the loop of the silver key. With a steady, gentle pull, Casper slid the key upward. It scraped against the stone, then, shing, it popped out of the crack and landed softly on the moss. The other animals went silent. They had spent an hour using all their strength, and Casper had solved it in a minute using his brain. "How did you know the twig would work?" asked Sammy the squirrel, amazed. "The problem wasn't the weight of the stones," Casper explained, "it was the shape of the hole. Sometimes, a big problem doesn't need a big push, it needs a small, smart tool. If you stop to think before you act, you'll find that the answer is usually lying right at your feet." Casper didn't keep the key for his hoard. He flew to the edge of the woods and dropped it right in the middle of the traveler's path, where the man would be sure to find it on his walk back. He learned that intelligence isn't about knowing everything, it's about using what you have in a clever way. From that day on, the animals didn't just go to Casper for news, they went to him for the smart way to solve their troubles. Story 30. In the deepest, mossiest cave at the foot of the great pine lived Barnaby the bear. Barnaby was a creature of habit. He loved the taste of wild honey, the scratching of his back against rough cedar bark, and above all, he loved his sleep. As the leaves in the whispering woods turned from bright green to a fiery gold, the other animals began to hurry. Sammy the squirrel was frantic, burying acorns in every secret hole he could find. The geese were practicing their V formations, honking loudly as they prepared for the long flight south. Why the rush? Barnaby would yawn, stretching his massive paws. The sun is still warm, and the berries are still sweet. There's plenty of time for winter. Barnaby was a procrastinator. He spent his afternoons napping in the sun instead of gathering the extra fat he needed for the long sleep. When the air turned crisp, he stayed by the river, trying to catch one last fish instead of lining his cave with warm, dry pine needles. One evening, the wind changed. It didn't whistle through the trees, it moaned. The sky turned a heavy, slate gray. Barnaby was outside his cave, looking for a late-season snack, when the first snowflake drifted down. It was tiny, white, and perfectly cold. It landed right on his black nose. Plink. It's just one flake, Barnaby muttered. I'll start my preparations tomorrow. But by the time the moon rose, the one flake had turned into millions. A great blizzard had arrived early. The berries froze into hard little pebbles, and the ground became as solid as stone. Barnaby scrambled toward his cave, but it was freezing. He hadn't gathered any moss. He hadn't gathered any dry leaves. The floor of his home was nothing but cold, damp rock. I'm so cold, Barnaby shivered, his teeth chattering like a woodpecker's beak. And I'm so hungry. I waited too long. Just then, he heard a rustle at the entrance of his cave. It was Sammy the squirrel and Pip. They were dragging a small burlap sack filled with dry husks and soft thistledown. We saw you napping while the wind was picking up, Barnaby, Sammy chattered. We knew you'd be shivering by midnight. We brought some of our extra bedding. Barnaby felt a warm glow of gratitude, even as his fur was covered in frost. Together, they spread the thistledown and the husks over the cave floor. It wasn't a perfect bed, but it was enough to keep the chill away. Thank you, Barnaby whispered, his voice heavy with sleep. I thought I had all the time in the world, but the world doesn't wait for a sleepy bear. Winter doesn't have a clock, Barnaby, Pip added. It only has a ready or not. Barnaby curled into a tight ball, the soft bedding finally trapping his body heat. As the snow piled up outside, sealing the entrance to the cave in a wall of white, Barnaby made a promise to himself. He wouldn't just live for the sunny days, he would respect the coming of the cold. He learned that preparation isn't a chore, it's a gift you give to your future self. From that winter on, Barnaby was the first bear to line his cave and the first to gather his honey. He still loved his naps, but he made sure his bed was made before the first snowflake fell. Story 31. In the center of the whispering woods, perched on a large, slippery moss-covered stone by the edge of the lily pond, lives Toby the toad. Toby was a cheerful fellow with bright golden eyes and a throat that could puff out like a small, green balloon. But Toby had one very big habit, he loved to talk. Ribbit ribbit. Did you see the dragonfly? It was blue. Or maybe it was teal. I think it had 4 wings, no, 6. And the water today is exceptionally bubbly, don't you think? Toby would croak, his voice bouncing off the water from sunrise to sunset. The problem wasn't that Toby was mean, it was that he never stopped talking long enough to hear what anyone else had to say. When Sammy the squirrel tried to tell him about a new berry bush, Toby interrupted to talk about a shiny pebble. When Daisy the deer mentioned the coming rain, Toby broke in to describe his favorite shade of mud. "Toby," Barnaby the owl whispered from a low branch, "you have 2 ears and only 1 mouth. Perhaps the forest has more to tell you than you have to tell the forest." Toby just let out a giant ribbit. "But I have so many thoughts, Barnaby. If I don't say them, they might just float away like bubbles." One afternoon, the sky turned a strange, shimmering silver. The wind stopped blowing, and the birds went completely silent. It was a hush-hush day, a rare time when the whispering woods held its breath before a great change. Toby was sitting on his stone, ready to tell a story about a particularly juicy beetle. And then I saw it, right under the snap. A small twig broke nearby. Toby opened his mouth to keep talking, but he remembered Barnaby's words. He did something he had never done before. He closed his mouth. He tucked his chin in and just listened. At first, he heard nothing. But then, as he stayed very still, the nothing turned into a symphony. He heard the tiny crinkle of a leaf being turned over by a beetle. He heard the hiss of the grass as a garter snake slithered by. And then, he heard a sound he had never noticed before, a deep, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum coming from deep within the earth. It was the sound of the water roots, the ancient veins of the forest that fed the lily pond. The thrumming was faster than usual. Toby realized the ground was vibrating. Because he was listening, he noticed the vibration moving toward the big rock. Thrum-thrum-thrum. He looked over and saw that the big rock was leaning. If it fell, it would block the only entrance to the minnow caves where the baby fish were sleeping. Toby didn't start a long story. He didn't puff out his throat to brag. He let out one single, sharp, urgent croak that echoed like a bell. The beavers heard it and looked up. They saw the leaning rock and rushed over, using their strong tails to brace it just as it began to slide. The minnow caves were saved. After the danger had passed, the beavers thanked Toby. "How did you know, Toby? We didn't see the rock move at all." Toby didn't launch into a 20-minute explanation. He smiled a wide, quiet toad smile. "I heard the earth telling a secret," he said softly. "I just had to be quiet enough to hear it." From that day on, Toby was still a talkative toad, but he became known as the best listener in the whispering woods. He learned that when you stop talking, you don't lose your thoughts, you find room for everyone else's. He realized that the world is full of beautiful stories, but you have to be silent to hear the best ones. Story 32. In the misty shallows of the sparkling stream lived a crane named Caspian. Caspian had legs like long, thin reeds and a neck that curved like a graceful letter S. To the other birds, he looked like a living painting, but Caspian felt like a total disaster. "I'm just too long," Caspian would sigh, tripping over a submerged branch. Splash! He would land in the mud, his white feathers turning a messy gray. "My wings are too wide, my legs are too spindly, and I have the balance of a dizzy frog." Every year, the birds of the whispering woods performed the dance of the reeds to welcome the spring. The swans would glide in perfect circles, and the kingfishers would dive like blue arrows. Caspian practiced in secret, but every time he tried to spin, his long legs would get tangled, and he'd end up beak first in the cattails. "Maybe I should just sit this one out," Caspian whispered to a dragonfly. "I'm built for standing still, not for dancing." The day of the festival arrived, and the wind began to blow, not a gentle breeze, but a wild, whistling gale. The reeds began to sway violently, bending almost to the water's surface. The swans tried to glide, but the choppy water tossed them around. The kingfishers tried to dive, but the wind blew them off course. "The dance is ruined," cried the heron. "The rhythm of the wind is too fast. We can't keep up." Caspian watched from the shore. He saw the reeds bowing and snapping back. He noticed the way the wind moved in long, sweeping curves, the same curves as his own neck. He felt a strange tingle in his long, spindly legs. Without thinking, Caspian stepped into the water. He didn't try to glide like a swan or dive like a kingfisher. He let his long legs sink deep into the mud, anchoring him like a mast. When the wind hit him, he didn't fight it. He let his long neck sway with the gusts. He spread his massive wings, catching the wind like a sail, and began to leap. Because he was so tall, he could reach the high winds that the other birds couldn't. He spun in wide, looping circles, his long legs trailing behind him like silver ribbons. He looked like he was part of the storm itself. Whoosh! Swish! Spin! The other animals watched in awe. Caspian wasn't clumsy anymore, he was magnificent. He wasn't trying to be neat or small. He was using his size to match the scale of the wind. Look at Caspian, the animals cheered. He's dancing with the storm. When the wind finally died down, Caspian landed softly on the bank, his chest heaving but his golden eyes bright. He wasn't muddy, and he hadn't tripped once. That was incredible, Caspian, the swan praised. We thought you were clumsy, but you were just waiting for a stage big enough for your wings. Caspian tucked his long neck into his feathers and smiled. He learned that grace isn't about being small or perfect, it's about finding the right rhythm for the body you were given. He realized that the things he thought were too much, his height, his wingspan, his long legs, were exactly the tools he needed to dance with the wind. From that day on, Caspian didn't hide in the shadows. He became the lead dancer of the reeds, teaching everyone that sometimes, you just have to wait for the right breeze to show the world how beautiful you truly are. Story 33. In a dusty, sun-drenched attic at the very edge of the Whispering Woods stood the old library. It wasn't a library for people, but for the creatures of the forest who sought the great knowing. The shelves were made of cedar, and the books were bound in dried birch bark and stitched with spider silk. Living among these shelves was a cat named Cleo. Cleo was a tortoiseshell cat with patches of orange, black, and white that looked like a spilled ink pot. She was incredibly curious. While the other cats were busy chasing mice in the pantry, Cleo was busy chasing stories. Why do the owls fly at night, Cleo? Asked Pip the squirrel one afternoon. Cleo didn't just guess. She leaped up to the third shelf, pulled out a thick bark book titled The Moon and the Wing, and flipped through the pages with a velvet paw. Because, Cleo read aloud, the stars have a song that can only be heard when the sun is sleeping. To fly by day is to miss the music. Cleo loved knowing things. She knew why the moss grew on the north side of the trees and why the salmon swam against the current. But Cleo had a secret worry. I know a lot of facts, she whispered to her reflection in a silver tray, but am I wise? Knowledge is just a pile of leaves, wisdom is knowing which way the wind blows. One spring morning, a great debate broke out by the lily pond. A giant, ancient snapping turtle named Thistle had moved into the middle of the pond, blocking the best sunning spot for the frogs. Push him out, croaked the frogs. He's too big. He's taking all our light. No, lure him away with tasty slugs, suggested the ducks. The animals ran to the old library. Cleo, you've read every book. Tell us the secret spell to move a giant turtle. Is there a lever? A pulley? A magical word? Cleo climbed to the highest shelf. She looked for books on turtle moving and pond management. She found plenty of facts about how much a turtle weighs and how fast they snap. But none of the books told her how to make everyone happy. She sat on the windowsill, looking out at the pond. She watched Thistle. He wasn't being mean, he just looked very, very tired. His shell was covered in thick green algae, and he moved as if every bone ached. Cleo didn't bring a book to the pond. She walked down herself, her tail twitching thoughtfully. She didn't shout, and she didn't bring slugs. She simply sat on the bank and waited. "Thistle," Cleo said softly, "the frogs are sad because they miss the sun. But I see that you are resting. Is the middle of the pond the only place you can find peace?" Thistle opened one heavy, ancient eye. "The center of the pond is the only place where the water is deep enough to cool my old shell, little cat. The shore is too shallow, and the rocks are too hard." Cleo smiled. She went to the beavers. "Don't build a lever," she told them. "Build a floating island of soft willow logs in the deep water, just past the sunning spot. Cover it with cool, wet moss." The beavers worked all afternoon. When they were finished, Thistle happily swam over to the new, cool island. He had his deep water and his soft bed, and the frogs had their sunning spot back. The animals cheered. "Cleo, which book did you find that in?" "I didn't," Cleo said, purring as she licked a paw. "I realize that knowledge is about finding the answers in the past, but wisdom is about listening to the heart in the present. You can't solve a problem with a book if you haven't looked at the person in front of you." Cleo returned to her library, but she didn't just read anymore. She spent her time teaching the animals that facts are the map, but kindness is the compass. She learned that being the smartest cat in the woods was good, but being the one who understood the why behind the what was the greatest story of all. Story 34. In the bustling, crumb-filled pantry of a farmhouse at the very edge of the Whispering Woods lived a tiny mouse named Monty. Monty was no larger than a walnut, with ears like pink petals and a twitchy nose that could send a cracker from 3 rooms away. But Monty didn't want crackers. Monty had a dream that the other mice called the Great Gilly Gully. "I am going to climb the mountain of cheese," Monty declared every morning, pointing his tiny paw toward the very top shelf of the pantry. On that shelf sat a giant, golden wheel of aged cheddar. To a mouse, it looked like a glowing yellow mountain, capped with a waxy red sunset. "Don't be silly, Monty," squeaked his cousin, Mac. "That shelf is 4 mousetails high. The wood is slippery, and the gap behind the flour sack is full of giant, hairy spiders. Just stay down here and nibble on these lovely toasted breadcrumbs. They're safe. They're easy." But Monty didn't want easy. He wanted the view from the top. He wanted to taste the sharp, tangy air of the high shelf. One Tuesday, when the farmhouse was quiet and the cat was napping in a square of sunlight, Monty began his ascent. He didn't just run at the wall, he had a plan. He used a fallen cinnamon stick as a ladder to reach the first ledge. He used a discarded piece of twine to swing across the great gap between the honey jar and the vinegar bottle. Twang! Monty landed on the second shelf, his heart racing. He was halfway there. But the air was different up here. It smelled of pepper and spices, making his nose sneeze. Achoo! The sneeze nearly knocked him off the ledge. "Maybe Mac was right," Monty whispered, looking down at the safe, crumb-covered floor. "It's a long way to fall." But then, he looked up. The golden mountain was right there, glowing in the dim light. He could smell the richness of the cheddar. It smelled like victory. Monty didn't give up. He found a row of decorative grooves in the wooden molding. He tucked his tiny claws into the wood, climbing inch by inch. His muscles ached, and his whiskers were dusty, but he kept moving. He climbed past the spider's den, which turned out to just be an old, harmless cobweb, and over the mountain of salt. Finally, with one last, mighty heave, Monty pulled himself onto the top shelf. The view was incredible. He could see the whole pantry, the kitchen beyond, and even the green tops of the trees in the Whispering Woods through the window. And there it was, the mountain of cheese. Monty didn't just eat. He sat on the very top of the golden wheel, looking out at the world. The cheese tasted better than any breadcrumb he had ever found. It tasted like hard work and big dreams. When he finally descended, using a dried spaghetti noodle as a slide, the other mice gathered around. "Did you do it, Monty? Was it scary? Was it worth it?" Monty smiled, a tiny bit of golden cheddar still on his whisker. "It was very scary," he admitted. "But the view from the top is much bigger than the view from the floor. If you only look at the crumbs at your feet, you'll never know how tall the world really is." Monty learned that ambition isn't about being the biggest mouse, it's about having the biggest heart. He realized that a small step is the start of every great climb, and that the only thing standing between a mouse and a mountain is the courage to keep climbing. From that day on, Monty was the mountain guide of the pantry, encouraging all the young mice to look up and reach for the high shelves of their own dreams. Story 35. In the highest, hollowest branch of the silver birch in the Whispering Woods lived an owl named Otis. Now, most owls in the woods were known for their booming, majestic voices. When the moon was full, the great owl choir would gather, and their hoo-hoo-hoo would echo all the way to the Blue Mountains. But Otis didn't hoo. When Otis opened his beak, the sound that came out was a soft, rhythmic click-tap whistle. "Otis, you're doing it wrong," hooted Gilda, a snowy owl with a voice like an opera singer. "An owl must sound like the deep wind. Your song sounds like a cricket playing a tiny flute. It's just not very owly, is it?" Otis felt his feathers droop. He practiced every night. He puffed out his chest, took a deep breath, and tried to push out a deep hoo. But all that came out was a cheerful click whistle tap. "Maybe I'm not supposed to be in the choir," Otis whispered to a passing firefly. "Maybe I'm just a broken owl." One midsummer night, a strange thing happened. A heavy, humid silence fell over the forest. The air was so thick that the sound of the great owl choir seemed to get muffled and lost in the leaves. The hoo-hoos sounded heavy and tired. The animals below couldn't hear the signal that it was time for the midnight games to begin. "The music is stuck," cried the fox. "The air is too heavy for the deep notes." Gilda tried to sing louder, but her deep voice just bounced off the thick, damp air. The forest felt grumpy and sluggish. Otis sat on his branch. He felt the rhythm of the crickets and the beat of the moth wings. He didn't try to hoo. Instead, he let out his own natural song. Click-tap whistle. Click-click-tap. Because his notes were high and sharp, they sliced right through the heavy, humid air. They didn't get muffled, they sparkled. The sound skipped across the pond and danced through the thickets. It sounded like a secret code, bright and energetic. The dormice woke up. The hedgehog started to dance. The fireflies began to pulse in time with Otis's beat. "Listen," whispered Daisy the deer. "It's the midnight song. It's different, but it's beautiful." Soon, the other owls stopped hooting and began to tap their talons against the bark, joining Otis's rhythm. The broken song had turned into a forest masterpiece. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, Gilda flew over to Otis's branch. "I was wrong, Otis," she said, bowing her head. "I thought there was only one way to be an owl. But the woods didn't need a loud hoot tonight, it needed your unique click." Otis fluffed his feathers, his golden eyes glowing with pride. He realized that being an individual isn't about being better than the group, it's about bringing the one sound that only you can make. He learned that the world doesn't need 1,000 copies of the same song. It needs the whistles, the taps, and the clicks that make the music complete. From that night on, Otis didn't try to change his voice. He became the percussionist of the pines, reminding everyone that you're different is often exactly what the world is missing. Story 36. In the quietest corner of the old potting shed, right where the sunbeams hit the floor in long, dusty golden bars, lived a spider named Silas. Silas was a weaver of the old school, He didn't just throw sticky lines together. He believed a web should be a masterpiece of geometry and grace. "Silas, you're overthinking it," buzzed Barney the fly, who spent most of his time dodging the very things Silas built. "Just zip zap zoom. A bit of silk here, a bit there, and presto, dinner is served. Why spend all night on a single spiral?" Silas just tucked his 8 legs neatly under his body. "A web isn't just a trap, Barney. It's a map of the wind. If I don't get the angles right, the first breeze will tear it to shreds. Persistence is the thread that holds the silk together." One Tuesday evening, Silas began his most ambitious project yet, the Great Silver Star. He wanted to span the gap between the rusty watering can and the handle of the garden spade. It was a huge distance for a spider his size. He started with the bridge thread. He climbed to the top of the spade, let out a long, shimmering line, and waited for the draft to carry it to the watering can. Snap! The wind was too strong. The line broke. Silas didn't sigh. He climbed back up and tried again. Snap! This time, a curious mouse ran past and brushed the silk away with its whiskers. "Give it up, Silas," called out a cricket from the woodpile. "The gap is too wide. The shed is too drafty. Just build a small, messy web in the corner like everyone else." Silas didn't listen. He climbed the spade for the 3rd time. He waited for the exact moment the wind died down, and whoosh, the thread caught. He tightened it, reinforced it, and began the delicate work of the inner spirals. He worked through the midnight hour. His silk glands ached, and his many eyes grew tired in the dim moonlight. He had to redo the center 3 times because a heavy dewdrop made the silk sag. Every time a thread broke, Silas simply turned around, cleared the mess, and started the line again. "One more loop," he whispered to himself. "One more anchor." As the sun began to peek over the horizon, the Great Silver Star was finished. It was magnificent. Thousands of tiny, perfect diamonds of dew clung to the silk, making the web glow like a neon sign in the morning light. Suddenly, the shed door swung open. A huge gust of wind, the kind that usually destroyed every web in the building, rushed in. The messy webs in the corners tore instantly. Barney the fly was tossed head over heels into a flower pot. But Silas's web didn't break. Because he had been persistent, because he had reinforced every angle and checked every anchor, the web didn't snap, it danced. It flexed with the wind and bounced back, stronger than ever. The other insects crawled out from their hiding spots, staring at the shimmering star. It's still there," Barney gasped, picking himself up. "How did it survive that?" "It didn't survive because it was strong," Barnaby the owl whispered from the rafters. "It survived because Silas was willing to start over. Persistence isn't just about finishing, it's about not letting the snaps stop the starts." Silas sat in the very center of his masterpiece, his heart full of quiet pride. He learned that the hardest part of any great work isn't the skill, it's the staying power. He realized that 1,000 broken threads are just the practice you need to build the one that holds. From on, Silas was the architect of the attic, teaching all the young spiders that the most beautiful things in the world aren't built in a zip-zap-zoom, but in the quiet, steady moments when you refuse to give up. Story 37. In the deepest, leafiest shadows of the whispering woods lived a young badger named Barnaby. Now, badgers are known for being tough, but Barnaby was known for being fast. He was especially fast when it came to finding snacks. One golden afternoon, Barnaby was prowling near the old hollow oak when he spotted something magnificent, a fallen honeycomb, dripping with thick, amber sweetness. It was tucked behind a curtain of ivy, hidden from the rest of the forest. Barnaby's stomach gave a loud rumble. He didn't see any bees nearby, and the honeycomb looked abandoned. He gobbled up a large chunk, the honey sticking to his whiskers and fur. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. But just as he was reaching for a second piece, he heard a tiny, rhythmic sobbing. He pushed aside a leaf and saw Buzz, a very small honeybee, sitting on a twig with his head in his tiny paws. "What's wrong, little Buzzer?" Barnaby asked, trying to hide the sticky honey on his paws. "Oh, Barnaby," Buzz cried. "Our hive worked all spring to gather that honeycomb. It fell during the windstorm last night. We were going to move it back to the high branch this evening, but someone has already eaten half of it. Now the baby bees won't have enough to eat through the frost." Barnaby felt a cold prickle in his chest. He looked at his sticky paws. He could easily say he just found it like that. He could say he saw a sneaky raccoon running away. He could even pretend he didn't know what honey was. I haven't seen anyone," Barnaby started to say. But the words felt like dry sand in his mouth. He looked at Buzz's shimmering wings and thought about the baby bees. Barnaby took a deep breath. "Buzz," he said, his voice a little shaky. "It was me. I thought it was abandoned, and I ate the first half. I'm so sorry." Buzz stopped crying and looked at Barnaby. He didn't sting him. He didn't even yell. He just looked surprised. You're telling the truth. Most animals would have just run away." "I did want to run," Barnaby admitted, "but the honey tastes like a lie now. It's not sweet anymore." Barnaby didn't just apologize. He spent the rest of the afternoon helping the bees. Because he was big and strong, he carried the remaining honeycomb back to the safety of the high branch, something the tiny bees would have struggled to do for hours. He even found a patch of late-blooming clover and showed the bees where to find fresh nectar to make up for what he had eaten. That evening, as the moon rose, the queen bee flew down to Barnaby. "Barnaby the Badger," she hummed, "you took our food, but you gave us something better, the truth. An honest neighbor is worth more than 100 honeycombs." Barnaby went back to his burrow, his fur clean and his heart light. He learned that honesty isn't about being perfect, it's about owning your mistakes even when it's embarrassing. He realized that a lie might save your skin for a minute, but the truth saves your soul forever. From that day on, Barnaby was the most trusted animal in the Whispering Woods. He learned that the sweetest thing you can ever have isn't honey, it's a clear conscience and a friend who knows they can believe every word you say. Story 38. In the dampest, leafiest hollow of the Whispering Woods lived a hedgehog named Horace. Horace was not what you would call a social butterfly. In fact, he was more of a grumpy pinecone. He had spikes that were always a bit too sharp, a nose that was always a bit too twitchy, and a frown that seemed permanently etched into his face. "Stay off my moss," Horace would grunt if a squirrel got too close. "Don't whistle so loud. I'm trying to nap." Horace lived by a simple rule: look out for number one. He spent his days gathering the softest leaves for his own bed and the fattest slugs for his own dinner. He even found a large, discarded toadstool that worked perfectly as a private umbrella. One Tuesday afternoon, the sky turned the color of an old bruise. A sudden, violent rainstorm broke over the woods. Splash! Plop! Drench! The animals scrambled for cover, but the trees were thin and the burrows were flooding. Horace sat snugly under his thick toadstool umbrella. He was dry, warm, and perfectly happy. "Silly animals," he muttered, watching a pair of shivering field mice huddle under a soggy dock leaf. They should have found their own umbrellas. It's a survival of the fittest world, after all. But then, he saw Rosie the rabbit. Rosie was the kindest soul in the woods. She always left extra carrots for the elders and sang lullabies to the lost birds. Now, she was shielding 3 tiny, shivering bluebird chicks with her own ears. She was soaked to the bone, her fur matted and heavy. "Please, Horace," Rosie called out over the thunder. "The chicks are freezing." Their nest washed away. Could they just sit under the edge of your toadstool until the rain stops? Horace looked at his spacious umbrella. There was plenty of room. But he huffed, if I let them in, they'll bring mud. They'll chirp. They'll ruin my peace and quiet. He turned his back. But as the rain came down harder, he heard a tiny, pathetic cheep-cheep from the chicks. It was a sound so cold and so lonely that it pierced right through Horace's prickly exterior. He looked at his own dry paws. Then he looked at Rosie, who was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. "Oh, for goodness sake." Horace grumbled, but he didn't sound very angry. He shuffled to the side. "Fine. Get in here. But no shivering on my good moss." Rosie hurried under the toadstool, tucking the chicks into the dry center. Horace grumbled about the crowded house, but as the wind whistled, he noticed Rosie was still a bit exposed to the spray. Without saying a word, Horace moved even further to the edge, letting his own back get a little wet so that the others could be completely dry. As they sat there, something strange happened. The silence wasn't annoying, it was cozy. The chicks stopped crying and fell asleep against Horace's, carefully flattened, quills. Rosie told a funny story about a confused owl, and for the first time in years, Horace actually chuckled. When the rain finally stopped and the sun peeked through the clouds, the animals thanked him profusely. "You saved us, Horace," Rosie said, giving him a gentle and careful pat. "You're a hero." Horace watched them go. He was a little bit wet and his moss was a little bit muddy, but his chest felt strangely warm. "A hero. Humph," he muttered, but he was smiling. He learned that kindness isn't about having extra to give, it's about being willing to be a little bit uncomfortable so that someone else can be safe. He realized that a dry umbrella is nice, but a shared one is much warmer. From that day on, Horace was still a bit prickly, but he always left a space under his toadstool for anyone caught in the rain. He found out that when you open your heart, even just a little bit, you don't lose your peace, you find a whole new kind of quiet joy. Story 39. In the manicured gardens on the edge of the Whispering Woods lived a peacock named Percival. Percival was a living rainbow. His tail was a shimmering fan of emerald, sapphire, and gold, dotted with eyes that seemed to wink at the sun. He spent hours every morning smoothing his feathers and admiring his reflection in the marble fountain. "Look at me," Percival would squawk, fanning his tail so wide it blocked the path. "Am I not the masterpiece of the forest? To be beautiful is to be important. To be plain is to be, well, invisible." Nearby lived Henrietta, a plain brown hen. Her feathers were the color of dried wheat, and her eyes were a simple, steady black. She didn't have a shimmering tail or a royal crest. She spent her days scratching in the dirt for seeds and tending to her nest in the tall grass. "Oh, Henrietta," Percival would sigh, looking at her with pity. "Don't you wish you had even one spark of my color? You blend into the mud so easily. It's a tragedy, really." Henrietta would just tilt her head and cluck softly. "The mud is where the seeds grow, Percival. And the brown grass is where I feel at home. There is more than one way to shine." One afternoon, a shadow moved through the garden. It wasn't a cloud, and it wasn't the wind. It was a hungry fox, creeping through the hedges. The fox didn't care about colors, it only cared about a meal. Percival saw the fox and tried to run. But his magnificent tail was too heavy. It snagged on the rose bushes, its bright blues and greens acting like a neon sign in the sunlight. "Help!" he shrieked, his beautiful feathers dragging in the dirt. He was trapped by his own vanity. Henrietta didn't run away. She saw Percival's trouble and immediately went to work. Because her feathers were the exact color of the dried leaves and the earth, she moved through the garden like a ghost. The fox looked right past her, unable to see the invisible hen. Henrietta let out a series of sharp, loud cracks and flapped her wings near the fox's face, creating a cloud of dust. She led the fox on a wild chase toward the thorny briar patch, disappearing into the brown brush where the fox couldn't follow. By the time the fox gave up and slunk away, Percival had managed to untangle his bedraggled tail. He was covered in mud, 3 of his golden eyes were torn, and he was shaking from head to toe. Henrietta trotted back, her brown feathers as neat as ever. "Are you all right, Percival?" Percival looked at his ruined tail, then he looked at the plain hen who had just saved his life. For the first time, he didn't see a tragedy. He saw a hero. You were invisible to the fox," Percival whispered. "But you are the bravest thing I've ever seen. My feathers are just a costume, but your heart is the real masterpiece." Percival learned that true beauty isn't what you carry on your back, it's what you carry in your soul. He realized that a shimmering tail is lovely to look at, but a steady heart is what keeps you safe in the shadows. From that day on, Percival still fanned his tail, but he did it to provide shade for Henrietta's chicks. He learned that being invisible to the world can sometimes be the most powerful way to be seen by your friends. Story 40. In the vast, golden savanna that bordered the whispering woods lived an elephant named Alara. Alara was magnificent, with ears like tattered velvet sails and tusks that curved like ivory moons. But Alara had a problem that the younger elephants whispered about behind her back: she was becoming forgetful. "Where did I leave my favorite scratching branch?" Alara would trumpet, looking confused. "And did we already visit the marula trees this morning, or was that yesterday?" The younger elephants, led by a confident bull named Jax, began to lose their patience. "The world is moving fast, Alara," Jax would say, leading the herd at a brisk pace. "If you can't remember the path, you're just slowing us down. We need sharp minds for the dry season." One year, the great heat stayed longer than ever before. The grass turned to yellow glass, and the usual watering holes shrank until they were nothing but cracked, baked mud. The herd was desperate. Jax led them to the North River, but it was a dry canyon of stones. He led them to the hidden spring, but it was a salty puddle. "We're lost," Jax admitted, his head hanging low. "Every place I remember is gone." The herd stood in the shimmering heat, their trunks drooping. That's when Alara closed her eyes. She didn't look at the dry horizon, she looked inward. She reached past her morning confusion and deep into the old memory, the stories her grandmother had rumbled to her when she was just a calf. "The memory of water," Alara whispered. "What was that?" Jax snapped. "Follow me," Alara said, her voice steady and ancient. She didn't lead them toward the rivers or the springs. She led them toward the Red Ridge, a place so dry and rocky that even the lizards avoided it. The younger elephants grumbled, certain they were walking toward their end. But Alara walked with purpose. She stopped at the base of a massive, lightning-scarred baobab tree that looked completely dead. "Dig here," Alara commanded. "There's no water in these rocks." Jax protested. "Dig," Alara repeated. "My grandmother told me that during the great thirst of the 100th year, the water went underground to hide from the sun. It waits beneath the roots of the oldest tree." The herd began to dig. They used their powerful tusks to break the sun-hardened crust and their trunks to hurl away the stones. Deeper and deeper they went, until the earth felt cool. Then, it felt damp. Suddenly, a clear, cold spring bubbled up through the red dust. The herd let out a joyous roar. They drank until their bellies were full and sprayed the cool water over their dusty backs. Jax walked over to Alara, his ears tucked back in shame. "I thought you were losing your mind, Alara. I forgot that a slow memory can go back much further than a fast one." Alara smiled, her ancient eyes crinkling. "A young mind is like a stream, it moves fast and sees what is right in front of it. An old mind is like a deep well. It takes longer to reach the bottom, but the water there is the coldest and the clearest. She learned that wisdom isn't about remembering where you put your branch, it's about holding on to the truths that save lives. From that day on, the herd never hurried Alara. They realized that while the young lead the way through the day, the elders hold the map for the years. Story 41. In the vibrant, humming fields that hugged the edge of the whispering woods lived a grasshopper named Gentry. Gentry was a virtuoso of the violin. Well, his legs were his violins. He spent every golden afternoon perched on a swaying stalk of wheat, playing melodies that made the wildflowers dance. Life is a song, friends. Gentry would chirp, leaping through the air. Why spend the sunshine worrying about the shade? The sun provides, and the music guides. Below him, a colony of ants worked in a silent, rhythmic line. They were led by a stern ant named Arthur. Arthur didn't look at the sky, and he certainly didn't dance. He carried grains of rice and bits of dried leaf that were 3 times his own weight. "Hey, Arthur!" Gentry called out, landing near the ant trail. "You've been carrying that same seed for 10 minutes. Put it down. Listen to this new upbeat jig I've composed. It'll put a spring in your segment." Arthur stopped, his antennae twitching with exhaustion. "Gentry, the wind is turning cold. The harvest moon is rising. If we don't fill the larder now, there will be no one left to hear your jig by December." Gentry just laughed. "There's always more grain, Arthur. You're too serious. You respect the work, but you don't respect the joy." But as the weeks passed, a shimmer left the air. The wheat stalks turned brittle and gray. One evening, a frost crawled across the meadow, turning Gentry's violin legs stiff and silent. He looked for a snack, but the fields were bare. The sun didn't provide anymore. It hid behind heavy, snow-filled clouds. Shivering and hungry, Gentry made his way to the great ant mound. He knocked on the tiny dirt door. "Arthur. It's Gentry. I have no food. My legs are too cold to play." The door opened, and a warm, earthy smell wafted out. Arthur stood there, his many legs crossed. He looked at the bedraggled grasshopper. "I suppose you want to come in and eat our grain?" Arthur asked quietly. Gentry hung his head. "I do. I realized I was wrong, Arthur. I didn't respect the hard work you were doing. I thought my music was the only thing that mattered." Arthur stepped aside, waving him into the warm, buzzing tunnels. "Come in, Gentry. We have plenty of room, and plenty of grain." As Gentry ate a delicious piece of dried corn, he looked around. The ants were safe and warm, but they looked bored. They had worked so hard that they had forgotten how to celebrate their success. "Arthur," Gentry said, his legs finally warming up. "I didn't respect your work, but I see now that you haven't been respecting your rest. You have the grain, but you've lost the song." Gentry picked up his violin. He didn't play a loud, silly jig. He played a slow, beautiful anthem of gratitude, a song that honored the long hours the ants had spent in the sun. The ants stopped working. They gathered around, their antennae waving in time to the music. For the first time all year, Arthur smiled. "I suppose," Arthur whispered, "that a full belly is only half a life. The other half is having a reason to feel full." Gentry learned that respect is a two-way street. He learned to respect the discipline and foresight of the workers, and the ants learned to respect the beauty and spirit of the artist. They spent the winter together, the ants providing the bread, and the grasshopper providing the soul. From that winter on, Gentry helped the ants carry seeds during the harvest, and every evening, the ants made sure to clear a stage so the music would never stop. Story 42. On the jagged, frost-covered peaks of the Stone Crag Ridge, which overlooked the Whispering Woods, lived a wolf named Silas. Silas was a shadow in the moonlight, sleek, silver-furred, and solitary. While the rest of his pack stayed in the valleys where the deer were plentiful, Silas preferred the silence of the heights. "I don't need anyone," Silas would growl to the cold wind. "Friendship is a leash, and I was born to run free." One evening, a fierce mountain gale began to howl. It brought with it a white blind, a snowstorm so thick you couldn't see your own paws. As Silas hunkered down in a shallow cave, he heard a sound that didn't belong on the ridge. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a hawk. It was a high, shaky ba triple A. Silas crept out. There, shivering behind a frozen gorse bush, was a lamb. It was tiny, a ball of white wool so matted with ice it looked like a fallen cloud. It had wandered away from the shepherd's flock in the valley and climbed too high. Silas's golden eyes narrowed. His stomach let out a low, predatory rumble. "Dinner has delivered itself," he whispered. He stepped closer, his teeth bared. But the lamb didn't run. It was too cold to move. Instead, the little creature looked up at the massive wolf and did something impossible. It hobbled forward and tucked its frozen nose right into Silas's thick, warm neck fur. It let out a tiny, trusting sigh and fell asleep. Silas froze. He was a hunter, a creature of the hunt. But the warmth of the lamb against his chest felt like a spark in the middle of a glacier. If he moved, the lamb would freeze. If he ate it, the silence of the mountain would feel heavier. "Stupid, tiny cloud," Silas grumbled, but he didn't snap his jaws. He lay down in the snow, curling his massive, bushy tail around the lamb like a furry wall. All night, the storm roared. Silas stayed awake, using his own body heat to keep the white blind from claiming the little intruder. He licked the ice from the lamb's ears, his rough tongue surprisingly gentle. When the sun rose over the sparkling, snow-covered ridge, the lamb woke up. It bounced on its wobbly legs and let out a cheerful baa. Silas stood up, feeling stiff. "Don't get used to it," he huffed. "I'm taking you back to the fence. And if you tell anyone about this, I'll howl extra loud at your window." Silas led the way down the treacherous slopes. He picked the paths where the snow was shallowest and stood between the lamb and the biting wind. When they reached the edge of the shepherd's meadow, Silas nudged the lamb toward the gate with his nose. The lamb turned around and licked the wolf's black snout before trotting toward the flock. Silas watched from the trees. He saw the shepherd find the lamb and give it a warm blanket. He felt a strange tug in his chest, a feeling that was the opposite of hunger. "I thought a leash was something someone put on you," Silas whispered to the trees. "But maybe friendship is just the string that pulls you back when you're drifting too far into the cold." He learned that being strong and alone is easy, but being strong and protective is a much greater challenge. He realized that an unexpected friend doesn't take away your freedom, they give your freedom a purpose. From that day on, Silas was still the lone wolf of the Stone Crag Ridge, but every spring, he would sit on the high rocks and watch the meadow below. And every now and then, a certain white sheep would look up and let out a loud, happy baa, knowing that the shadow in the trees was the warmest place in the world. Story 43. In a bustling workshop made of mud and alder branches at the edge of the silver stream lived Bramble the beaver. Bramble was the forest's finest engineer. He could calculate the weight of a log with a single sniff and knew exactly how many twigs were needed to stop a spring flood. Efficiency. Structure. Function. Bramble would mutter, slapping mud onto his latest dam. "If it doesn't hold back the water, it doesn't belong in the woods. We have no time for fluff, friends." One afternoon, while Bramble was measuring a particularly sturdy oak branch, he saw a young otter named Opal sitting by the bank. She wasn't swimming, and she wasn't hunting. She was holding a smooth, flat river pebble and rubbing it with the crushed petals of a bright blue cornflower. "What are you doing, Opal?" Bramble huffed, his tail twitching with impatience. That stone won't stop a leak. It's too small for a foundation and too round for a wedge. You're wasting good daylight on a useless rock. Opal didn't look up. She dipped a tiny twig into some yellow pollen and drew a swirling sun on the stone. It's not for the dam, Bramble. It's a painted pebble. I'm making it because the gray mud was looking a bit lonely today. Bramble snorted. Lonely mud. Mud doesn't have feelings, Opal. It has density. It has grip. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a spillway to reinforce. But that night, a heavy mist rolled into the Whispering Woods. It was the kind of gray, damp fog that made everyone feel a bit heavy and sad. The animals stayed in their burrows, and even the birds forgot to sing. Bramble sat in his lodge, looking at his perfectly straight walls and his perfectly sturdy floor. Everything is functional, he whispered. So why do I feel so grumpy? He stepped outside for a drink of water and tripped over something near the entrance. He looked down. It was Opal's pebble. In the dim, gray light of the fog, the bright blue petals and the yellow sun glowed like a tiny lantern. Bramble picked it up. It didn't help the dam. It didn't keep him warm. But as he looked at the swirls, he felt a strange spark in his chest. His heart felt a little lighter, and the gray fog didn't seem so pressing. It makes the mud look better, Bramble admitted to the silent trees. The next morning, Bramble didn't go straight to the dam. He went to the meadow and gathered some red berries and charcoal from an old campfire. He found a wide, flat piece of birch bark. He didn't draw a blueprint. He dipped his paw into the red juice and painted a picture of the silver stream, with its jumping fish and swaying reeds. When the other animals walked past the dam that day, they stopped. They didn't talk about the structure or the strength of the wood. They talked about the spirit of the stream painted on the bark. They smiled. They stayed a little longer to chat. The work felt easier because the workplace was beautiful. Opal swam by, her whiskers twitching. Is that a new kind of insulation, Bramble? Bramble laughed, a deep, rumbly sound. No, Opal. It's a painted spirit. I realized that while the logs keep the water out, the art keeps the joy in. A dam protects our bodies, but beauty protects our hearts. He learned that art isn't a waste of time, it's the color of life itself. He realized that a world made only of straight lines and sturdy walls is a cage, but a world with a few, useless, painted pebbles is a home. From that day on, the Silver Stream Dam was the most famous spot in the woods. It was the strongest dam for miles, but it was also the most colorful, reminding every creature that once you've taken care of the must-haves, you should always make room for the maybes. Story 44. In the darkest corner of the Whispering Woods, tucked among the silver-leaved acacia trees, lived a tiny firefly named Flicker. Flicker's wings were like transparent silk, and the light in his belly glowed with a soft, warm yellow, much like a tiny candle flame. Every night, Flicker would look up at the sky and sigh, his antennae drooping. Oh, he would whisper, look at that giant star. It is so bright, so massive, and so high. Its light illuminates the entire forest, reflects in the river, and guides the wolves. My light can barely light up a single dewdrop. I am so dim and unimportant. The more Flicker compared himself to the giant star, the unhappier he became. He began to hide under large leaves, dousing his light out of shame. Why does a tiny spark like me even exist when the world has such magnificent lights, he thought. One night, heavy, obsidian clouds rolled across the sky. The giant star was swallowed by the darkness. The forest became so pitch black that even the owls lost their way. In that deep silence, Flicker heard a tiny, trembling sob coming from the moss below. He fluttered down and found a minnow-sized ant sitting on a twig, clutching its head. I can't see the path, the ant cried. The great star is gone, and I'll never find my way back to the colony. Flicker immediately landed beside the ant and turned his light on as bright as he could. Don't be afraid, he said softly. I am here. The ant looked up, its eyes widening. Oh, what a beautiful light. It's exactly what I needed. My light? Flicker asked, surprised. But I am so small. I can't light up the whole forest like the star above. The ant smiled. The star is beautiful, yes. But it is very far away. It doesn't show me the hole in front of my feet or help me find my front door. Your light is right here, next to me. To me, right now, you are the most important light in the universe. Flicker realized something powerful in that moment. He guided the ant all the way home. Along the path, he saw other small creatures using his glow, a spider weaving a web, and a snail finding a succulent leaf. When Flicker returned to his branch, the clouds parted, and the giant star began to shine again. But this time, Flicker didn't feel small. The star's place is the sky, but my place is the earth, he said with pride. It guides those who are far, but I guide those who are near. It lights up the world, but I light up a friend's path. He learned that comparison is a wind that blows out your own flame. He realized that true value isn't measured by how far your light reaches, but by how close you stand to those who need it. From that night on, Flicker never hid again. He kept his small but vital glow burning for everyone in the darkest corners of the woods. Story 45. On the sun-scorched plains at the edge of the Whispering Woods, a great race was announced. The prize wasn't a trophy or gold, but the golden leaf of the high ridge, a leaf said to grant its owner a year of perfect health. Step aside, everyone, bragged Jet the jackrabbit. Jet was a blur of gray fur and twitching ears. I can reach the ridge before the sun hits its peak. I'm fast, I'm focused, and I'm Jet. At the starting line stood Terence the tortoise. Terence was as old as the oak trees, with a shell that looked like a collection of weathered stones. You? Jet laughed, kicking up dust. Terence, the sun will have set, risen, and set again before you even reach the first pebble. Why even try? Terence didn't look at Jet. He looked at the steep, winding path leading up the mountain. The finish line doesn't care how fast you start, Jet, he said in a slow, gravelly voice. It only cares that you arrive. Discipline is the quiet engine that wins the race. Ready. Set. Go. Jet vanished in a cloud of dust. He was a streak of lightning, leaping over fallen logs and sprinting through the tall grass. He was so far ahead that he couldn't even see Terence anymore. Halfway up the mountain, Jet saw a patch of sweet, wild clover. I have so much time, he thought, his stomach rumbling. I'll just have a quick snack. Terence won't be here for hours. The clover was delicious. After eating, the sun felt warm on Jet's fur. Maybe a 5-minute nap, he yawned. I'm so fast, I can make up the time in 10 leaps. Meanwhile, far below, Terence was moving. Plod. Step. Plod. He didn't stop to look at the butterflies. He didn't stop when his legs felt heavy. He kept his eyes on the dusty path directly in front of his nose. He passed the clover patch. He saw Jet snoring loudly under a bush. Terence didn't shout, he didn't even speed up. He just kept his steady, rhythmic pace. Plod. Step. Plod. The path became steeper and the air grew thin. Terence's shell felt like a mountain on his back. But every time his mind told him to rest, his discipline whispered, just 1 more inch. The sun began to dip toward the horizon. Jet woke up with a start. Oh no! The sun! He looked toward the ridge. He saw a tiny, stone-like shape just a few feet from the golden leaf. No! Jet screamed, his legs churning like pistons. He flew up the mountain, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was fast, faster than any animal in the woods, but he had wasted his focus. Just as Jet's paw reached out for the leaf, Terence took one final, heavy step. Snap! Terence's beak touched the golden leaf first. Jet skidded to a stop, panting and covered in sweat. How? I'm 10 times faster than you. Terence took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. Speed is a gift, Jet, but discipline is a choice. You ran against me, but I ran against the mountain. You relied on your talent, but I relied on my consistency. Terence learned that a big burst of energy is useless if it isn't directed. He realized that the greatest distance is covered by the smallest steps, as long as you never stop taking them. From that day on, Jet still ran fast, but he started practicing his Terence pace for the long hauls. And Terence? He kept the golden leaf in his burrow, a reminder to everyone that the race doesn't always go to the swiftest, but to the one who refuses to quit. Story 46. In the crystal-clear currents of the silver stream, which wound its way through the heart of the whispering woods, lived a salmon named Silas. Silas was strong, with scales that shimmered like hammered silver and a tail that could flick him through the water like a released spring. Every autumn, a great calling hummed through the water. It was the time for the salmon to swim back to the high pools at the very top of the mountain to start the next generation. But to get there, they had to face the glass wall, the great waterfall of the crag. It's impossible, bubbled Finnegan, a smaller fish, as the group reached the base of the thundering falls. The water crashed down with the sound of 1,000 drums, creating a wall of white foam and cold mist. Look at the height. Look at the power. If we jump and miss, we'll be smashed against the rocks. Many of the salmon turned back, content to stay in the lower, slower pools. It's safer here, they said. Why risk everything for a jump that might fail? Silas looked up. The waterfall was terrifying. He felt the vibration of the crashing water in his very bones. His heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't fearless, in fact, he was shaking. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Finnegan, Silas said, his eyes fixed on the shimmering crest of the falls. Courage is feeling the fear and jumping anyway because the high pools are where we are meant to be. Silas took a deep breath of the oxygen-rich bubbles. He swam back, gaining speed, and then, with a mighty thrust of his silver tail, he launched himself into the air. Whoosh! He flew through the mist, his body arching like a bow. But the water caught him mid-air, its heavy weight dragging him down. Splash! He fell back into the churning foam, exhausted and bruised. See? Finnegan cried. It's too much. Give up, Silas. Silas didn't answer. He swam in a tight circle, shaking off the daze. He watched the water. He looked for the hidden stair, the small pockets of calmer water behind the main flow where a fish could catch a second's rest. He swam back even further this time. He didn't just jump, he aimed. With a burst of energy that made his muscles burn, he soared again. This time, he landed in a small crevice halfway up. The water tried to push him out, but he gripped the stone with his fins, gasping for breath. One more leap. The biggest one yet. Silas gathered every bit of strength he had ever gained from swimming against the current. He launched himself toward the very lip of the falls. For a second, he seemed to hang motionless in the golden sunlight, a silver arrow defying gravity. With a final, desperate flick of his tail, he cleared the edge. He landed in the calm, deep turquoise of the high pool. The water here was silent, sweet, and filled with the scent of pine. He looked back down. He saw the others still waiting in the foam. One by one, inspired by Silas's silver flash, they began to try. Not everyone made it on the first go, but they didn't stop. Silas learned that the waterfall wasn't there to stop him, but to show him how strong he really was. He realized that the greatest rewards aren't found in the easy currents, but at the top of the hardest climbs. From on, Silas was known as the King of the Crag. He taught the young fry that being brave doesn't mean you aren't afraid, it means you don't let the noise of the waterfall drown out the song of your destination. Story 47. In the very center of the Whispering Woods stood the grandfather oak. His trunk was as wide as a cottage, and his bark was a map of deep ridges and silver moss. For 500 years, he had watched the snow fall and the flowers bloom. He had sheltered generations of squirrels and provided the hollows for 1,000 owls. But the grandfather oak was tired. His highest branches were brittle, and his leaves didn't catch the sun quite like they used to. "I am fading," the oak whispered to the morning mist. "Soon, there will be nothing left of me but a stump and a memory. What was the point of 5 centuries if it all ends in dust?" At his roots, tucked under a protective fold of moss, lived a tiny acorn. The acorn was no bigger than a thimble, with a polished brown cap and a smooth, hopeful shell. "Grandfather," the acorn squeaked, "why do you drop so many of us? We fall into the mud, we get buried by squirrels, and we disappear. It seems like a very lonely way to go." The grandfather oak looked down, his leaves rustling with a dry, melodic sound. "You aren't disappearing, little one. You are beginning. My time of reaching for the sky is coming to an end, but my legacy is just starting to wake up." One night, a great autumn storm swept through the woods. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain turned the earth to soft clay. With a slow, majestic groan that echoed like thunder, the grandfather oak finally leaned over and settled into the forest floor. The forest was silent. The squirrels cried, and the owls flew to the younger pines. It seemed as if the heart of the woods had stopped beating. But as the grandfather oak lay there, something began to happen. His massive trunk became a nurse log. The soft, decaying wood held moisture like a sponge. Ferns began to grow in his furrows. Bright orange mushrooms sprouted like tiny umbrellas, and beetles found homes in his hollows. And right there, in the very spot where the oak's crown had once touched the sun, the tiny acorn felt a stir. Encouraged by the rich soil the grandfather had provided, the acorn pushed a tiny, pale green shoot through the dirt. It was small, fragile, and bright. It used the space the grandfather had cleared in the canopy to drink in the sunlight. Years passed. The moss covered the old log until it was just a gentle, green hill on the forest floor. But rising from that hill was a strong, young oak tree. It had the same silver moss on its bark and the same sturdy reach in its branches. "I see you, grandfather," the young oak whispered as its roots reached deep into the earth, touching the ancient roots that still remained below. The young tree realized that the grandfather oak hadn't truly left. He was in the strength of the new wood, the shade of the new leaves, and the richness of the soil. He had traded his height for a future. The young oak learned that a legacy isn't something you leave behind, it's something you put into the world. He realized that we are all just links in a long, beautiful chain, and that the greatest thing we can do is provide the ground for someone else to grow even taller than we did. From that day on, the young tree grew with a sense of purpose. He knew that one day, he too would become a nurse log, and the story of the Whispering Woods would continue, leaf by leaf, acorn by acorn, forever. Story 48. In a cozy burrow near the edge of the Whispering Woods lived Barnaby, a box turtle with a shell as patterned as a mosaic floor. While most turtles were content to know every pebble in their garden, Barnaby had a wandering heart. He spent his evenings staring at the silver trail of the Milky Way, wondering what lay beyond the great briar patch. "Why go anywhere?" his neighbor, Tiberius, would huff, munching on a predictable piece of lettuce. "The lettuce is here. The mud is here. The world beyond the briars is full of sharp rocks and fast water. Curiosity is just a fancy word for getting lost. But Barnaby couldn't help it. He didn't want a map of the ground, he wanted a map of the stars. One spring morning, Barnaby packed a small bundle of dried berries and began to walk. He didn't walk fast, he was a turtle, after all, but he walked with purpose. He pushed through the great briar patch, ignoring the tiny pricks on his shell. He waded through the shimmering shallows, where the water tickled his chin. By the third day, the woods began to change. The trees weren't oaks or pines anymore. They were tall, white-barked birches that looked like ghostly pillars. The air smelled of salt and distant thunder. "I'm lost," Barnaby whispered, looking at the strange shadows. Tiberius was right. "I've traded my lettuce for a labyrinth." He sat on a flat stone, feeling very small. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first star appeared, the North Star, steady and bright. Barnaby remembered a story the great owl once told: the stars are the forest's oldest map. They never move, even when the trees do. Barnaby looked up. He realized that if he kept the North Star over his right shoulder, he was heading toward the great blue salt water. If he kept it behind him, he was heading home. He spent weeks traveling. He met a mountain goat who taught him how to find the hidden paths in the rocks. He met a seagull who told him stories of islands that floated like lily pads. He saw a waterfall that fell upward when the wind blew just right, and flowers that glowed like neon lamps in the dark. One evening, he finally reached the edge of the world, or so it seemed. It was a massive, endless expanse of blue water that stretched until it touched the sky. The waves roared like lions and whispered like silk. "I found it," Barnaby breathed. The end of the map. But as he looked out, he saw a tiny flicker of light far across the water. Another shore, another woods, another story. Barnaby stayed by the sea for a long time, learning the language of the tides. When he finally returned to the Whispering Woods, he looked different. His shell was scratched, and his legs were dusty, but his eyes were full of the horizon. Tiberius was still in the same spot, eating the same lettuce. "See? You're back. You wasted all that time just to end up right where you started." Barnaby smiled and opened his bundle, revealing a smooth, blue seashell that echoed with the sound of the waves. "I didn't end up where I started, Tiberius. I brought the whole world back with me." Barnaby learned that curiosity isn't about finding an end, it's about realizing there isn't one. He realized that the map of the stars doesn't just show you the way home, it shows you how big home really is. From that day on, Barnaby was the Starlight Scout, teaching the young animals that while your feet must stay on the ground, your heart should always be looking for the next star to follow. Story 49. In the sun-drenched acacia grove, just where the Whispering Woods met the great savanna, lived a young giraffe named Gilly. Gilly was a bit of a marvel. Her neck was long and slender like a golden flute, and her spots looked like a map of burnt orange islands. But Gilly had a secret: she was incredibly clumsy. While the older giraffes moved with the grace of swaying trees, Gilly often found her legs tangling like discarded skipping ropes. "Oof," she'd grunt, tripping over a sleeping warthog. Crash! She'd stumble into a termite mound, sending a cloud of red dust into the air. "Gilly, dear," her mother would sigh, nudging her upright. "Slow down. Your head is so far from your hooves that sometimes your brain forgets what your feet are doing." The most coveted prize in the grove was the starfruit, a cluster of glowing, honey-sweet blossoms that grew only on the very tip-top of the ironwood tree. The tree was slick, tall, and surrounded by jagged rocks. "I'm going to get the starfruit," Gilly announced one morning. The other giraffes chuckled. "Gilly, you tripped over a flat shadow yesterday," teased Gerald, a tall bull with a very straight neck. "You'll never make it across the rocks, let alone reach the top without toppling over." Gilly felt her ears go hot. But she didn't turn back. She started toward the ironwood tree. Trip. She stumbled on a hidden root. She got back up. Slip. Her hoofs skidded on a smooth stone. She balanced herself and kept going. By the time she reached the base of the ironwood, her knees were scraped and her heart was thumping. She looked up. The starfruit seemed a mile away, shimmering in the golden heat. She stretched her neck. Wobble. Her back legs began to shake. She reached a little further. Snap. A low branch broke under her weight, and she tumbled sideways into a soft patch of tall grass. Give it up, Gilly, called a passing zebra. It's too high, and you're too shaky. Gilly sat in the grass for a long time. She looked at her long, spindly legs. She felt like a collection of sticks that didn't quite fit together. But then, she saw a spider. The spider was trying to spin a web between two thorns. The wind blew the web down. The spider started again. The wind blew it down again. The spider didn't look sad, it just started the third thread. Resilience, Gilly whispered. It's not about not falling. It's about how many times you're willing to stand up. Gilly stood up. This time, she didn't just reach. She planted her back legs wide, like a sturdy tripod. She tucked her tail and focused all her energy on the very tip of her nose. She moved slowly, inch by inch, letting her muscles find their own rhythm. Her neck stretched further than it ever had before. Her tongue, long and purple, curled out like a clever vine. Snip! With a delicate tug, she plucked the starfruit. When she walked back to the grove, her legs still wobbled a little, but her head was held high. She shared the sweet fruit with everyone, even Gerald. How did you do it? Gerald asked, tasting the honey-sweet juice. I thought you were too clumsy. I am clumsy, Gilly laughed, a bright, bubbly sound. But I realized that falling down is just a part of the trip. Resilience is the strength to realize that the ground is just a place to push off from so you can reach the stars. Gilly learned that being perfect isn't nearly as important as being persistent. She realized that her long, awkward legs weren't a mistake. They were the tools she needed to reach the highest dreams, as long as she wasn't afraid of a few tumbles along the way. From that day on, Gilly was the sky reacher of the grove, teaching all the young animals that a stumble is just a dance move you haven't mastered yet. Story 50. In the very center of the Whispering Woods, where the silver stream met the roots of the grandfather oak, there was a place that didn't appear on any map. It was called the Library of the Heart. It had no walls, no ceiling, and no dusty shelves. Instead, the stories lived in the rustle of the leaves, the shimmer of the fireflies, and the dreams of the sleeping animals. For 49 nights, the forest had been humming with new tales. The animals had gathered to hear about brave badgers, honest bees, and traveling turtles. But on the 50th night, a great silence fell. Who will tell the last story? Whispered the little bluebird chicks. Is there any magic left? The great owl, the keeper of the woods, landed on a low-hanging branch. He didn't open a book. Instead, he looked at all the animals gathered in the clearing: Barnaby the Badger, Silas the Wolf, Gilly the Giraffe, and even little Flicker the Firefly. The 50th story, The Owl Hooted Softly, is not mine to tell. It is yours to live. The animals looked at each other, confused. But we are just characters, said Terence the tortoise. We only exist in the words. The owl shook his head. A story is like a seed. Once it is told, it leaves the mouth of the teller and takes root in the heart of the listener. Barnaby, you learned about honesty. Silas, you found friendship in the cold. Gilly, you found resilience in your stumbles. Those stories aren't just sounds in the air anymore, they are parts of who you are. Suddenly, the air in the clearing began to shimmer. Every lesson learned, every act of kindness shared, and every moment of courage faced over the last 49 tales began to glow like 1,000 tiny lanterns. The library of the heart is never full, the owl continued. Every time you choose to be kind instead of grumpy, every time you share your umbrella in the rain, and every time you tell the truth even when it's hard, you are writing a new page. You are the authors of the Whispering Woods. The animals realized then that the end wasn't a closing door, but a wide open gate. They didn't need a narrator to tell them what to do next. They had the story map inside them. As the moon reached its highest point, the grandfather oak's leaves rustled one last time. The 50th story is called The Beginning, the trees seemed to whisper. Because a good story never truly ends, it just changes shape and moves into the world. The animals drifted back to their burrows and nests, but they didn't go back to their old ways. They walked a little taller, spoke a little kinder, and looked at the stars with a little more wonder. They learned that the greatest magic in the world isn't found in a wand or a spell, but in the power of a story to change a heart. They realized that while books may have a final page, a life lived with purpose is a story that writes itself forever. And so, the Whispering Woods became the most beautiful place in the world, not because of its trees or its streams, but because of the 50 stories that lived inside every creature who called it home.